That night, the storm had cut the world into pieces. Wind screamed like torn canvas, rattling the aluminum siding of the little broadcast station on the edge of town. Snow slapped against the glass in thick sheets, blinding the night outside in a white wall. The thermometer on the porch had dropped below 0 hours ago, and the roads were all but gone, buried under drifts that would not see a plow until morning, if morning even came. Inside, the only light came from the humming fluorescent tubes above, a tired yellow glow that made everything look older than it was. The walls were plastered with outdated maps, frequency charts, old mugs of cold coffee, sticky notes curling at the edges. A lonely radio console blinked with red and green LEDs, steady as a heartbeat, keeping the emergency channel alive for anyone desperate enough to call. And at that console sat Anya, headset crooked on her head, shoulders hunched against the creeping cold that found its way through the thin walls. She was 28, wiry, sharp-eyed, and exhausted. She had been pulling the overnight dispatcher shift for 6 months, ever since the last guy quit after a heart attack or so, they said. Her job was simple: sit here through the long hours of the storm, answer the calls that came in on Channel 6, and relay what she could to the sheriff's department or the volunteer fire crew. Most nights, it was silence. A storm made it worse. Nobody drove. Nobody dared. She'd tried reading. She'd tried sketching. But mostly she just listened to the static, like the hiss of some great ocean that never ended. But at 1:13 a.m., the static changed. At first it was subtle, a ripple in the hiss, like something brushing against the microphone. She straightened, adjusting the dial. Her pen stilled on the notepad. Then, faintly so faint she thought it was her imagination, came the sound of a melody. Not words, not music from an instrument, but a voice, a woman's voice, low and rhythmic, humming in a tune that never quite resolved. It wound its way between the static, lilting, rising, falling, always just at the edge of recognition. Anya froze. She lifted her headset slightly, thinking maybe it was interference from her phone, or from the cheap fluorescent lights above. But no, the sound was inside the band. On Channel 6, on the emergency line, her lips parted, her breath clouded faintly in the cold. "Hello?" She whispered into the microphone, her own voice too loud in her ears. The melody didn't stop. She glanced at the clock. 1:14. The storm outside howled harder, as if leaning closer against the station walls, eager to hear. She tried again. "This is County Emergency Dispatch. Please state your emergency." For a moment, nothing but static. Then the voice slipped into clarity, not humming now, but singing. A lullaby. Old-fashioned, like something a grandmother might croon at a cradle. But the words were wrong. They were in no language she recognized, syllables drawn out, heavy, almost sticky with resonance. Her skin prickled as the melody curled into her ears, into the spaces between her ribs. Her hand twitched toward the volume knob, but she didn't turn it down. Something in her couldn't. The song carried a weight of loneliness, the kind that hollowed the bones. It whispered of long winters, of empty rooms, of nights that never ended. It was beautiful, in the way a frozen lake was beautiful, shimmering, perfect, and deadly. Anya swallowed hard. She forced herself to write on her notepad. 1:14 a.m. Unknown female voice on Channel 6, singing. Possible interference? She sat back, headset pressing tight against her ears. Her heartbeat thundered in her chest, keeping time with the melody. The dispatcher's handbook, now lying open beside her, had a section about prank calls, about radio bleed from hobbyists, even about atmospheric phenomena. But nowhere did it mention singing. And then, as if to mock her doubt, the song shifted. It said her name, Anya, drawn out in the same melodic cadence, almost woven into the lullaby. Her throat tightened. She tore the headset off and stared at it, as if it might sprout teeth. The room was utterly silent without it. Just the low hum of the fluorescent light, the hiss of the heater trying and failing to warm the air. She could hear her own pulse in her ears. Slowly, reluctantly, she lifted the headset back. Anya, his stomach dropped. She checked the band. Still Channel 6, the emergency line. It wasn't a bleed from another station. She had the squelch dialed in tight. It wasn't a recording. Her software would have flagged it. Someone somewhere was broadcasting live. Her fingers hovered over the phone. She could call the sheriff, wake him. But what would she say? That she was hearing voices in the static? That someone was singing to her from a dead frequency in the middle of a blizzard? She pictured his tired laugh, the click as he hung up. She was alone. The song resumed, softer now, almost coaxing. Anya's eyes flicked to the second receiver, a backup scanner locked on weather frequencies. Lightning cracked across the storm, too far to see but close enough to rumble through the walls. For a heartbeat, the two sounds overlapped. The thunder outside, and the lullaby inside her ears. The hairs on her arms stood straight, and then silence. The line went dead. Static again, pure and empty. Anya sagged back in her chair, breath leaving her in a shaky exhale she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her pen clattered to the desk. She rubbed her temples, half laughing at herself. But when she looked down at her notepad, her blood ran cold. She had written more than she remembered. Not just her note 1:14 a.m. unknown female voice, but underneath it, in a shaky scrawl she didn't recognize, were the words, "I'm outside." Her pen was still in her hand. She dropped it. Her chair scraped back as she stumbled to her feet, eyes locked on the words. Her skin felt clammy, her chest tight. She turned toward the window, where the snow still beat against the glass in relentless waves. She couldn't see more than a few feet beyond the floodlight, but for the first time that night she was certain something was out there. The lullaby hadn't ended. It had only moved. The heater clunked in the corner, and for an instant, she thought it was a knock at the door. Her mouth went dry. She reached for the switch that killed the outside floodlight. Her finger hovered, trembling. She told herself it was stupid that she'd seen nothing but snow, a blank white field, but she was more afraid of what she might see. She didn't flip the switch. She just stood there, staring at the glass until her reflection blurred into the storm. Behind her, the radio crackled once more. The lullaby returned, and this time, it wasn't alone. Another voice had joined it, lower, rougher, male, singing the same tune, slower, heavier, as if harmonizing from somewhere far below. The air in the room grew cold enough that her breath fogged, and on the notepad beneath "I'm outside," another line appeared, ink glistening as if freshly written. "Open the door." The storm outside had not eased, only thickened. The air itself made of shards of ice, and the endless hiss of snow against the windows. And when Anya stepped into the threshold of the broadcast shack with her heavy coat and flashlight, she realized how thin the walls had always been, how fragile the sense of shelter that little station offered. The moment the door closed behind her, the night pressed closer, swallowing the beam of her light until it could not reach more than a few steps ahead. The antenna tower rose like a black skeleton in the storm, its wires trembling with the wind, and as she moved toward it, the song seemed to gather around her, faint but insistent, a thread of melody winding its way through the gale. She tried to convince herself that it was nothing more than interference, that her ears were tired and inventing patterns in the static, but when she leaned against the frozen metal of the tower, she felt the vibration travel up her bones and into her skull, a low, steady hum that resolved itself into that lullaby she could not escape. It was not simply sound, it was resonance, as if the storm itself had become a chamber for the voice, carrying it across the ridges and hills until it poured into her like water. For a long moment she stood there in the snow, eyes stinging from the wind, listening with a mixture of dread and awe. She thought about calling the sheriff, thought about retreating to the safety of the shack, but the memory of her own notepad flashed in her mind, the words she had not written, "I'm outside," scrawled in a hand that could not have been hers. That was not static. That was not tiredness. That was something else. She staggered back from the tower, boots sinking into the drift. The pickup truck sat half buried nearby, its windshield frosted over, and for the first time that night she felt watched, as if every snowflake carried an eye, as if the whiteness itself had intent. The melody shifted with her movements. When she turned toward the hills east of town, the sound grew sharper, piercing, almost guiding. When she turned toward the empty highway, it dulled. She realized then, with a slow tightening in her chest, that the song was not in her head at all. It had direction, a source, and it was calling her east. She rushed back inside, heart racing, slammed the door and bolted it, trying to catch her breath in the stale heat of the room. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, steady but somehow thinner than before, and the console blinked as though nothing had changed. She sat down hard, headset in her lap, and forced herself to put the moment into words. 1:50, 2 a.m. Song persists. Antenna resonating. Possible rogue transmitter? Her handwriting trembled across the page, but writing it gave her the illusion of control, as if facts could hold back whatever pressed in from the storm. Then the landline rang. The sound split the silence like a blade. She fumbled for the receiver, pressed it to her ear, and said the words she had been trained to say, "County Emergency Dispatch." But there was no voice on the other end, no request for help, only the hiss of static. And then, unbearably, the same lullaby pouring through the line, so intimate it seemed to come from inside her own chest. She slammed the phone down, heart hammering, but even as she did, the console lights flickered, the speakers cleared, and through them came a voice that was not humming now but speaking, quiet and near, as if the mouth that formed it hovered inches from her own ear. "Why are you afraid, Anya?" She almost fell from the chair. Her training told her to remain calm, to extract information, to keep the caller talking, but her body betrayed her with a shaking breath and a dryness in her throat that made words fail. When she finally forced them out, they sounded thin and broken. "Identify yourself. This is an emergency channel. If you continue to misuse it, you will be lonely." The voice interrupted. Soft, certain, the lullaby swelled beneath it, twining around the word like ivy around stone. "You don't have to be lonely, Anya. Come to me. The storm will guide you." Her gaze shot to the map pinned to the wall, the old topographic survey of the county that still bore the notes of her predecessor. Among the faded markers was a red circle around Crow Hill, the abandoned transmitter site that no one had touched in decades. It lay east of town, in the direction the song had sharpened. She whispered the name under her breath, and the voice in the speakers answered as if she had given it a prayer. "Yes, you hear it too." Heskine crawled. She snatched her phone, desperate to call the sheriff, but before her fingers could move across the screen, it buzzed to life with a text from an unknown number. 3 words that made her stomach lurch. "Don't call him." She dropped the device as though it were aflame. The lullaby rose, triumphant now, as if it had been waiting for her to test its boundaries. "Don't call him," the voice echoed, playful and cruel. "You're mine tonight." The console lights flared red. A shriek of feedback pierced the air, and through the distortion the voice splintered into fragments, desperate and commanding all at once. Come now, Anya, hill, hill, hill." She tore the headset from the jack, plunging the room into silence so sudden her ears rang with it. The storm pressed close to the walls, filling every gap, and for a long moment she simply leaned against the desk, breath ragged, sweat mixing with cold until her skin felt fevered and clammy at once. Still, she picked up the pen again. She wrote because it was the only weapon she had left. 29 a.m. Source believed to be old Crow Hill transmitter. Signal intentional. Interference escalating. She dropped the pen, wiped her damp palms against her jeans, and tried to steady her breath. When her eyes returned to the notepad, her heart froze. Beneath her own shaky handwriting, another line had appeared, fresh and glistening, as though the ink had not yet dried. "Good girl." She staggered back, knocking over the chair, pulse pounding in her ears. She knew then, with a certainty deeper than fear, that the voice would not let her go. It was not a plea for help. It was not a prank. It was a summons, and if she resisted, it would dig deeper, bleed further into every frequency, into every silence, until it consumed her. And the most terrifying realization of all was not that it wanted her, but that somewhere deep in her chest, beneath the panic and the denial, a part of her wanted it too. The road out of town was not meant for travel that night, yet Anya found herself steering the old county pickup into the white abyss, headlights swallowed whole by the snow almost the moment they touched it, the wipers fighting in vain against the endless flakes. The storm made the world look unfinished, as though creation had paused midway, erasing lines, softening shapes, turning houses into vague shadows and trees into crooked silhouettes. She gripped the wheel so hard her fingers ached, and every mile felt like it could be her last. The lullaby did not come from the radio anymore. It was in the air itself, threaded through the howl of the wind, rising and falling like a current beneath the storm. Sometimes she caught it in the hum of the engine, sometimes in the squeal of the wipers, sometimes even in her own breathing, as though her lungs had been tuned to the melody without her consent. The more she tried to shut it out, the clearer it became. until she realized that ignoring it only sharpened its edge. She thought of turning back. The heater barely worked. The tires slipped on ice, and Crow Hill was 5 miles of winding road that no sane driver would attempt in a night like this. But the memory of the notepad pulled her onward, the ink that had written itself, "Good girl," still shining in her mind like a wound. She knew the song would not end if she stayed behind. It would seep through every wall, every device, until it lived with her always. She could not live like that. The truck climbed slowly, tires groaning against the grade. The forest rose on either side, branches heavy with snow that cracked and fell in sudden bursts, startling her each time. The trees leaned close together, crowding the road, and in the beam of her headlights their shapes looked almost human. Shoulders bent, arms outstretched, heads bowed as though listening. She tried not to stare at them too long. At a sharp bend, she pulled over, chest tight, breath fogging the windshield. For a moment, she sat in the silence of the cab, engine ticking, trying to steady herself. She imagined calling the sheriff even now, admitting everything, but the phone lay dark on the seat beside her, and she could not bring herself to touch it. The last time she had tried, it had spoken back, so she drove on. The road narrowed, snow piled high on either side, the guardrails buried, until it was nothing more than a tunnel of white. At times she felt the wheels leave the ground for half a second, skating across ice, before catching again. She leaned forward over the wheel, whispering to herself, urging the truck upward, each breath a plea. And then, through the storm, she saw it, a light on the ridge. It was faint, yellowed, flickering, but unmistakable, aglow where there should have been nothing but abandoned steel and empty snow. Her pulse surged. The lullaby swelled in her ears, sweeter now, almost warm, and she felt a strange pull in her chest, as though the light itself had fastened a string around her ribs. The road ended at a small clearing, half buried in drifts, where the skeletal frame of the old transmitter tower leaned against the storm. Beside it stood a low concrete building, its roof sagging under decades of snow, its windows long gone, its doorway gaping black. The light she had seen came not from within, but from a lantern hung above the entrance, swaying in the wind, flame inside guttering yet never dying. She killed the engine. The silence that followed was immense, as though the world itself had stopped. Her boots crunched in the snow as she stepped out, the cold slamming into her lungs so hard she staggered. She pulled the coat tight, lifted her flashlight, and made her way toward the building. The lullaby grew louder with each step, echoing not through the air but inside her skull, as if her bones had become tuning forks. At the threshold she paused, light trembling in her hand. The lantern swayed above, casting warped shadows across the doorway. The air smelled faintly of rust and something older, damp earth long undisturbed. She swallowed hard and stepped inside. The interior was a single room, concrete walls sweating with condensation, floor littered with broken equipment and rusted tools. A desk stood against the far wall, warped with age, and on it sat a radio transmitter, its surface thick with dust except for the knobs, which shone faintly as though they had been turned only hours ago. A family photograph leaned against the transmitter, black and white, edges curled, showing a man, a woman, and a little girl standing stiffly in front of the tower itself in some long-forgotten summer. Their faces were blurred, not by time, but by the way the picture had been taken, as though the camera had not wanted to keep them. Anya's breath shook. She reached toward the transmitter, fingertips hovering above the switch. The lullaby surged, almost desperate, the voice no longer distant but right at her ear, whispering, coaxing. "Stay," it crooned. "Stay with me." Her hand trembled. Every instinct told her to run, to flee the building, to never look back. But another part of her, the part hollowed by years of lonely shifts, by nights when the world forgot her, leaned forward instead. She wanted to know. She needed to know. She flipped the switch. The transmitter went silent. For one heartbeat, so did the world. The wind outside stopped. The snow seemed to freeze in midair. Even her pulse faltered, as though everything had been suspended in that single act. Then, slowly, the silence filled again, but not with the storm. With breathing, heavy, close, behind her. Her flashlight beam jerked across the room, but nothing moved. The shadows held, yet she could hear it, unmistakable, a slow exhale that did not belong to her. She turned back toward the desk and froze. The photograph had changed. The little girl was gone. Only the man and woman remained, standing stiffly, smiling faintly, their blurred faces somehow sharper now, clearer, as though watching her with interest. Anya staggered back, heart in her throat. She reached for the door, but before she could touch it, the transmitter crackled to life again, though her hand had not moved, though the switch still lay in the off position. The lullaby returned, louder than ever, and threaded through it, as soft as a whisper and as sharp as a knife, came her name. Anya. The name in the song was no longer drifting through the static, but carved into the air itself, every syllable of it vibrating against the walls of the transmitter room, until she felt the sound in her teeth and in the hollows of her chest. The photograph on the desk glared back at her with its newly sharpened faces, the mother's eyes catching the faint light of her flashlight. The father's blurred smile stretched too wide, and the empty space where the child had once stood seemed to widen like an open mouth. Anya's hand hovered above the transmitter switch again, but she knew now that it did not matter whether the dial was turned or broken or even torn from the wall. The signal was not bound by wires or circuits anymore. It had found her, and in finding her it had rooted itself inside the space she carried wherever she went. The storm outside had gone silent when she first cut the machine, but now, as if to mock her, it rose again in violent bursts, hammering the roof, pushing against the cracks in the concrete walls, rattling the lantern at the doorway until its flame guttered and spat sparks across the floor. The lullaby wove itself into the howling wind like thread through fabric, indistinguishable from it, yet never lost within it. And with each repetition, the tune bent itself closer to something almost recognizable, almost human, almost like the half-remembered melody her mother had sung to her when she was a child afraid of the dark. Her knees weakened. She whispered aloud, her voice small, "What do you want from me?" The answer came not from the transmitter, but from the shadows behind her, soft and patient, only to be heard. She spun, flashlight beam slicing across bare concrete, catching on piles of rusted scrap, and for a fraction of a second she thought she saw movement, a figure pressed into the far corner, pale and indistinct, like fog trapped in the shape of a person. But when she stepped closer, it dissipated, leaving nothing behind but the dripping sound of water from the ceiling. Her breath echoed harshly in her ears. She returned to the desk, desperate for something tangible, and touched the photograph with trembling fingers. The paper was cold, damp, as though it had been lying outside in the snow. She turned it over, and words had appeared in a faint, shaky hand. "We stayed. Now it's your turn." The room shuddered. A low groan rose from beneath the floor, not mechanical, not the creak of wood or metal, but something deeper, as though the earth itself were shifting, stretching, making space. Her flashlight flickered, and for a heartbeat she thought she saw the concrete under her feet bulge and ripple like skin. She backed away, every instinct screaming for her to run, but the doorway was no longer empty. The lantern swayed in slow arcs, and in its glow stood the outline of the little girl from the photograph, her form thinner than shadow yet anchored by the glint of her eyes, black and glassy. She said nothing. She only tilted her head, listening to the lullaby as though it belonged to her, and with each tilt the song grew sharper, digging into Anya's skull until she pressed her palms against her ears. "I can't," Anya whispered. "I won't." "Oh." The child's mouth curved into the faintest smile, and the lantern went out. Darkness rushed in like water through a broken gate. The lullaby was everywhere now, inside the walls, inside the floor, inside her own throat. She stumbled through the dark, hands scraping against concrete, desperate to find the doorway again. But each step seemed to lengthen the room, stretching the space until she could no longer tell if she was moving forward or circling in place. Her flashlight clicked uselessly in her grip. The batteries dead, though she had charged them only hours ago. "Stay," the voice coaxed, layered now. No longer a single singer, but a chorus of overlapping tones, male and female, old and young, every voice bending itself into the same sweetly cruel melody. "Stay with us, Anya. It is so cold outside. It is so empty. Let us fill the silence." She tried to scream, but found the air thick in her lungs, her breath dragging as if something pressed against her chest. Her knees buckled and she collapsed onto the damp floor, palms slapping against a surface that no longer felt like concrete but something warmer, softer, pulsing faintly with a rhythm that made her gag. The chorus rose. The shadows around her thickened. She realized then that the transmitter room had no corners anymore, no edges or walls, only a spiraling depth that pulled her downward, the desk and the photograph already swallowed by it. And through that depth, she saw it. Not a figure, not a body, but a wound in the world, wide and humming, shaped like a mouth. It sang the lullaby, every note dragging at her bones, and in its center burned the faint red light of the transmitter, blinking like an eye that had been waiting for decades to open again. She clawed at the floor, dragging herself backward, but the song bent her will, making her limbs heavy, urging her closer. For a fleeting instant, she felt how easy it would be to surrender, to let herself sink into that voice, to rest after years of restless nights and endless solitude. It promised her a place, a family, an end to the cold silence that had haunted her even when the world was full of people. Her head bowed toward the floor, the melody wrapped around her name like silk. But somewhere inside her chest, a jagged fragment of fear broke through, sharp enough to cut the spell. She forced her eyes upward, fixed them on the doorway she could no longer see but could still imagine, and with every ounce of strength left, she whispered, "No." The room recoiled. The voices shrieked, fractured, the lullaby collapsing into a screech of static. The floor heaved beneath her, throwing her against the wall. In the pitch dark she crawled, hands bleeding from concrete, until her fingers found cold air. She dragged herself through the doorway, tumbled into the snow outside, and lay gasping beneath the storm. The wind roared again, deafening, and the world returned in fragments, the tower swaying above her, the lantern at the entrance relit, though she had seen it extinguished, the forest beyond shifting as though every tree leaned closer to hear. She staggered to her feet, legs trembling, heart hammering so violently it blurred her vision. Behind her, the building stood silent, the doorway black, the song quiet for now, but she knew it had not ended. Because when she looked down at her own hand, she saw words etched into the skin of her palm, thin lines of frost that formed letters she could not mistake. "You sang with us." The drive down from Crow Hill felt longer than the climb, as though the road itself had grown in the hours since she had ascended it, stretching in the storm like some living thing, unwilling to let her leave. The truck slid more than once, tires catching on ice, her arms aching from holding the wheel steady. The forest leaned close, branches brushing the windows, and in the shifting shadows she thought she saw faces, pale and blurred, watching her with the same blank attention the photograph had held. She forced her eyes back to the snow-choked road, whispering to herself, promising that dawn was only hours away, promising that if she could just reach the station, everything would make sense again. But the lullaby never fully left. It no longer filled the cab, no longer thundered against her ribs, but it lingered at the edges of sound, the hum of the heater fan, the grind of the wipers, the whistle of the wind through a crack in the passenger door. Each time she told herself it was gone, the melody curved back, faint and patient, as though reminding her it could wait as long as it needed. By the time the yellow glow of the station appeared through the storm, she was shaking so badly her teeth clattered. She pulled into the half-buried lot, killed the engine, and sat in the silence, staring at the building she had left hours before. It looked the same old siding, snow piled against the door, the antenna tower swaying above, but her chest tightened as though she had never left at all, as though Crow Hill had followed her down the mountain and was waiting inside. The interior was unchanged, the heater still struggling, the fluorescent light still buzzing, the console still blinking its steady green. But the air was different. The silence was heavy, deliberate, not the natural quiet of machines, but the pause between breaths. She dropped into the chair, headset untouched, and stared at the notepad where she had written her last log. There were new words beneath her scrawl. "Welcome back." Her throat closed. She tore the page free, crumpled it, threw it across the room, but the sound it made when it landed was not the hollow crack of paper but a soft sigh, almost a voice exhaling. She pressed her palms against her temples, fighting the rising panic. For long minutes she sat in the hum of the room, daring the silence to break, but the console held steady. No feedback, no lullaby, no whisper of her name. Eventually, exhaustion forced her forward. She lifted the headset with trembling hands, pressed it to her ears, and listened. Only static. She exhaled shakily, shoulders sagging. For the first time since the night began, she thought it might truly be over. She even managed a thin, nervous laugh. the sound harsh in the empty room. Perhaps the storm had twisted her mind. Perhaps Crow Hill was nothing but an old ruin, echoing with the ghosts of bad wiring. Perhaps the photograph had been nothing more than a trick of the light. She began writing again, forcing each word into the logbook, anchoring herself to procedure. 4:32 a.m. signal diminished, returning to static. Possible weather interference. Her handwriting steadied, her breathing slowed. And then, from the speakers, a sound so faint she thought she imagined it. A single breath, sharp and small, as though someone had leaned too close to the microphone. Her pen slipped, leaving a long scratch of ink across the page. She froze, headset still clamped tight. Another breath followed, then another, a rhythm, and after the third, a child's voice. Soft as snowfall. You already sang with us. The static surged, filling the headset, and beneath it rose the lullaby. No longer distant, no longer coaxing, but woven into the very bones of the signal. Endless and inescapable. She ripped the headset away, hurled it across the room, clapped her hands to her ears, but the melody remained. Not from the console, not from the phone, not from the walls or the storm, but from within. It rang in her chest, pulsed in her veins, whispered behind her teeth when she opened her mouth to cry out. Anya stumbled to her feet, knocked over the chair, pressed her back against the door. She tried to will herself into silence, into stillness. But when her lips parted again, she realized the sound filling the room was her own. She was humming, the same tune, slow, steady, wordless. Her knees buckled. She bit her lip until she tasted blood. But even then the sound slipped through, gentle and relentless. The more she tried to stop, the more natural it felt, as though the lullaby had always been waiting there, a second heartbeat hidden beneath her own. Her reflection in the darkened window caught her eye. The storm beyond blurred the glass, but she could see herself faintly, the headset dangling, the logbook open, her lips moving. For a heartbeat, she thought she was imagining it, but then her reflection smiled, a fraction too wide, a moment before she did. The room tilted. The storm outside pounded harder, as if applauding, as if eager. Anya pressed her hand against the window, the glass icy beneath her palm. For a second, she thought she felt something press back, colder still, shaping her fingers into unfamiliar patterns. Frost spread outward from the touch, sketching words and delicate lines across the pane. Sing louder. Her breath fogged the glass. The reflection mouthed the words before she could. She stumbled away, heart racing, pressed her back to the console. The lullaby swelled inside her until she thought her ribs might crack from the pressure. She closed her eyes, whispered, "No, no, please." But the sound that spilled from her throat was no longer hers. It was the song, full, clear, perfect, and somewhere, in the endless white outside, other voices answered. The storm carried them down from Crow Hill, across the frozen fields, through the antenna tower, and into the bones of the station, until the room itself hummed with 1,000 echoes. The walls vibrated, the floor trembled, the fluorescent light swayed, but all of it was background to the melody that now belonged to her, as much as it belonged to them. The phone rang once, sharp, cutting through the chorus. She snatched at it, desperate for another human sound. But when she pressed it to her ear, she heard only her own voice singing back, delayed by half a second, as if the world itself had become a recording of her. Her hand shook. She dropped the receiver, and in that final moment before dawn, when the storm began to ease and the first gray light tried to pierce the sky, the station stood silent to anyone passing by on the road. The console blinked. The tower swayed. But if anyone had pressed their ear close enough to the static on Channel 6, they would have heard a lullaby, low and unbroken, carrying one name through the snow. Anya, Story 2, The Blackout Confession. The wind pressed itself against the old mountain lodge as though it wanted in, every window pane trembling, every loose shingle above lifting and falling with a hollow groan. Snow slapped the shutters in waves, not soft but hard, each gust spraying crystals through the smallest cracks until they hissed against the wooden floor like sand on a shore. Noah sat on the edge of the narrow bed, the oil lamp at his side throwing a weak orange circle that seemed too small for the room. Shadows clung to the corners, shifting whenever the flame bent with the draft. His boots dripped meltwater onto the rug, leaving dark stains that spread like ink. He rubbed his hands together, though the air remained damp and cold, and thought about how quickly everything had gone wrong. The road had vanished first, hidden under drifts before he could even see the sign for the lodge. Then the headlights of his truck had failed, swallowed by white, until the forest itself disappeared. By the time he stumbled through the door of the half-empty building, snow clung to his collar, his eyelashes, the creases in his palms. The caretaker had offered a key and a muttered apology about the generator, and then, with a shrug heavy as resignation, vanished back into the storm to check the pipes. That was 2 hours ago. The man had not returned. Now Noah sat with the lamp, the only living flame in the building, listening to the silence left by the blackout. It was not the silence of peace, but of absence. No hum of wires, no whisper of vents, no thrum of machines that mark the modern world. Only the storm outside and the wood groaning in its frame. The absence was louder than any sound. He tried to distract himself. He had unpacked, changed into dry socks, poured whiskey into a chipped glass he found in the cabinet. The drink warmed his stomach but did nothing for the chill in his chest. He pulled the blanket over his shoulders, leaned against the headboard, told himself that it was only one night. Then came the creak. At first it blended with the lodge's usual complaints, the sigh of the rafters, the pop of old knots in the wood. But this was different. It came from below, measured, steady, as though someone were walking barefoot across the floor. He straightened, listening. The lamp flickered against the walls, making them seem to lean closer. His breath clouded faintly, as though the room had grown colder still. Another creak, then another. Steps. He stood, lamp in hand, and crossed to the door. His fingers trembled against the latch. He pulled it open slowly, letting the light spill into the hallway. The corridor was long. The wallpaper faded into the color of old parchment, the stairwell at the far end swallowed by shadow. No figure stood there, no sound but the storm's muffled howl beyond the walls. Noah exhaled. He told himself the wood had shifted. That was all. He closed the door, set the lamp back on the desk, and then he noticed the paper. It lay just inside the threshold, edges curled, damp as though carried by snow. He picked it up with stiff fingers, smoothed it against the desk, and read the words written in ink that had blurred but not disappeared. Keep listening. I need you to hear me. Noah's mouth went dry. The storm raged outside. The rafters groaned above, but none of it mattered as much as that scrap of paper in his hand. That plea written as though someone knew he would be here, in this room, on this night. He turned it over, searching for a signature, an explanation. Nothing. Only the wet mark of snow seeping into the fibers. The silence stretched. Then the radio spoke. It sat on the dresser, a relic from the lodge's older days. Wood casing cracked, dial yellowed, antenna bent. He had not plugged it in. He doubted it even worked. Yet now its dial glowed faintly green, the needle quivering across empty bands. Static hissed through the speaker, thin at first, then thicker, shaping itself into rhythm. 3 knocks. A pause. 3 knocks again. Noah's skin prickled. He stepped closer, lamp raised, staring at the machine that should have been dead. The static faded, replaced by a whisper so faint it seemed to hover not from the radio but from the very air around him. Don't stop listening. His hand jerked back as though struck. The note on the desk fluttered in the draft. The lamp guttered low, shadows swelling against the walls. He wanted to run, to grab his coat, his bag, to plunge into the storm even if it meant freezing by the roadside. But his legs would not move. His chest felt heavy, pulled down by the weight of that whisper, the same way snow drags the branches of a tree until they break. Instead, he stared at the radio, humming on the dresser. He stared at the note with its bleeding ink. He stared at the darkness in the corners of the room that seemed deeper than the dark should be. And as the storm battered the mountain, Noah realized that the silence he had feared was gone. Something else had taken its place. The storm had not relented. It pressed itself against the wooden lodge like a restless sea, rattling the shutters and seeping into the cracks until every surface seemed to hum with cold. Noah sat in the glow of the lamp, the radio still whispering its thin static. The note spread out before him on the desk. The words blurred when he stared too long, but even when he closed his eyes, he could still see them etched against the dark. Keep listening. I need you to hear me. He told himself it was a prank, some cruel joke left behind by the caretaker, or carved into the routine of this place by years of stranded travelers who had grown bored of storms. But no explanation held when he remembered the knock, the sound of feet on wood, the way the note had been waiting the instant he opened the door. His hands would not stop trembling. The whiskey in his glass rippled as though stirred by a breath. The radio cracked again, louder this time. Not the simple hiss of empty air, but the slow thud of something striking. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more, the same pattern he had heard below his room. He stepped closer, lamp in hand, and leaned toward the speaker. The static swirled, thickened, shaped itself into words. "I don't want to be seen," the voice whispered. It was faint, like a confession spoken through a wall. Only heard. Noah staggered back, breath fogging in the chill. His knee struck the bed frame, nearly toppling the lamp. He steadied himself, throat burning with the urge to shout, but no sound left him. The note shifted on the desk, the damp edge curling. For a moment he thought the ink was bleeding further, but then he realized new words were forming, faint at first, then darker, spreading letter by letter as though the paper itself had learned how to write. "I didn't mean to hurt her." The pen on the desk had not moved. His own hand lay clenched at his side, and yet the letters glistened, wet and undeniable. His stomach turned. He tore the note away, crumpled it, tossed it into the corner. But when he looked back at the desk, another slip of paper waited there, pale and damp, words already crawling across it. I tried to hide it. Under the floor, Noah's chest tightened. He grabbed the lamp, held it high as though the light could burn away what the storm had dragged into the room. The shadows only stretched longer, deeper. He wanted to scream for the caretaker, to beg for another voice. But the silence told him he was alone. Alone with someone who did not want to be seen. The radio popped again. Static curled, then broke into a murmur. The same voice, softer now, trembling. "I didn't know she would fall. I didn't know she would bleed so much. I thought I could fix it." Noah's knees weakened. He pressed himself against the cold wall, the lamp rattling in his grip. His breath came in shallow bursts, the air sharp in his lungs. The voice spoke as though reciting a story it could not stop telling, a story it needed him to carry. On the desk, another note appeared. Her eyes stayed open. I couldn't close them. He felt the whiskey rise in his throat, sour and hot. He turned from the desk, but the papers would not leave his sight. They multiplied slowly, one after another, each curling at the edges, each letter glistening as though freshly written by invisible hands. They littered the wood like a confession unraveling across pages, one that had no end. The lamp guttered. The flame bent low, almost dying, before flaring again. Shadows danced across the walls, long and thin, stretching higher than the ceiling should allow. Noah clutched the lamp as though it were the last barrier between him and the storm. The voice sighed through the radio, almost pleading. "You hear me, don't you? That's all I want." For someone to hear. Noah's lips parted. His voice cracked as he whispered, "Who are you?" The answer came, but not as a name. Just a man who didn't know what to do. The storm pounded harder, rattling the lodge to its frame. Noah staggered to the window, peered out, but the glass was coated with frost. The world beyond nothing but white. He pressed his palm to it, desperate for proof of something ordinary. A car, a plow, even a single lantern in the distance, but there was nothing. Only snow and darkness. When he turned back, the desk was covered. Dozens of notes lay scattered, some overlapping, some drifting to the floor. Each carried fragments of the same story. She slipped. I pushed. I didn't mean to. I thought she was asleep. I buried her. I locked the floor. Don't let them know. Don't let them see. The words tangled in his mind until they blurred into one endless plea. He stumbled backward, lamp shaking, throat dry. The radio hissed again, louder now, and through the static came the sound of sobbing. Raw, broken, a man's grief spilling into the room. Noah pressed his free hand to his ear, but the sound did not lessen. It filled the lodge, pressed against his ribs, until he thought his chest might split with the weight of it. Then the voice returned, harsher than before. Don't leave me alone with this. If you turn away, I'll knock again. I'll knock until the boards break. I'll knock until you open the floor yourself. The lamp sputtered once more, and Noah thought he saw movement in the corner where the rug lay bunched, as though something beneath it shifted, waiting for the boards to lift. He clutched the lamp closer, his knuckles white, and whispered into the storm-thick silence, "I hear you. God help me. I hear you." The sobbing eased. The static softened. The notes on the desk fluttered, their ink drying as though satisfied. But the last slip of paper, resting alone in the center, bore words that made Noah's blood run cold. "It's your turn to keep the secret." The lamp burned low, the glass chimney streaked with soot, and Noah sat hunched over the desk, staring at the sea of papers that had risen while he blinked. The notes were no longer few, no longer scattered. They layered one atop another until they seemed to grow out of the wood itself, curling upward like fungus feeding on rot. Each bore words half legible, some smudged by damp, some so sharp they looked freshly written, and all of them whispered the same story in different fragments, a confession without an end. His throat ached from the dryness in the air. He poured the last of his whiskey, but the liquid burned without warmth, sliding into him like ice. His hands shook when he set the glass down. He wanted to brush the papers aside, sweep them from the desk, tear them to shreds, but when he lifted one, its surface clung to his skin, as if the fibers had grown roots into his fingertips. He had to peel it away, and when he did, faint marks remained on his hand, ink lines that faded slowly like bruises. The radio breathed in the corner. Its dial glowed steady now, the green stronger, the static more deliberate, as though it had settled into a rhythm. Beneath the hiss, the voice continued, steady and broken in turns. "I kept her under the floorboards. I thought the boards would keep quiet, but they creak. They creak when I try to sleep." Noah pressed his palms to his ears, but the voice did not fade. It vibrated through the bones of the room itself, through the chair, through the glass chimney of the lamp, until he could not tell whether he was hearing with his ears or with his ribs. The sobbing returned, low at first, then stronger, and the notes fluttered as if stirred by breath. He bent forward, pressing his forehead against the desk, whispering to himself, "It isn't real. It isn't real." But when he opened his eyes, new words had appeared on the paper beneath him, ink fresh and glistening. "You're sitting above it now." Noah's breath stopped. He stared at the floor, the thin rug bunched near the bed, the boards beneath warped by years of damp. He told himself the message was a lie, that it was meant only to frighten, but his body betrayed him with a shiver so deep it rattled his teeth. Slowly, carefully, he lowered himself to the floor. The lamp cast his shadow across the boards, stretched and twisted. He pressed his palm against the wood. At first it was only cold. Then, faintly, it pulsed. His hand recoiled as though shocked. He stumbled back, nearly toppling the lamp, heart slamming against his ribs. He whispered hoarsely into the silence, "No, no, you're not here. You can't be here." The radio hissed louder, the voice breaking into fragments. "Urgent now. They'll find it. They'll dig. You have to keep it hidden. You promised. You promised you'd listen." The boards creaked beneath his feet, though he had not moved. The sound came from below, from weight shifting where there should have been none. His stomach turned as he imagined it, something heavy pressing upward, eyes open in the dark, waiting for him to lift the floor. He wanted to leave, to snatch his coat, tear the door open, and run into the storm, no matter if it buried him alive. But when he reached for the latch, his fingers froze. The metal was freezing, almost burning, and when he pulled his hand back, he found another note pressed against his palm, though he had not touched paper. "If you leave, I'll tell them it was you." His knees buckled. He pressed himself against the wall, lamp trembling in his grip. The notes on the desk shifted, sliding slowly toward the floor like a cascade of snow breaking loose. They landed without a sound, settling across the rug, spreading toward the bed. One caught his eye. Its letters were larger, written with such force the fibers had torn. "I see you, Noah." He choked out a laugh, a cracked, desperate sound. "How do you know my name?" The radio answered. The voice no longer trembled but grew calm, almost relieved. "Because you're listening." The storm pounded against the shutters, shaking the window panes, but inside the lodge there was no other sound but that voice, no other light but the lamp. Noah stood in the center of it all, hands shaking, staring at the rug that no longer looked like fabric but like a shroud. He felt as though if he pulled it back, the secret beneath would swallow him whole. The lamp guttered. The flame bent low, then flared, and in that moment, He thought he saw movement under the rug, the faint rise and fall of something breathing. He stumbled back, knocking against the bed. His chest heaved, his breath ragged. The notes on the floor glistened in the lamplight, their words brighter than before. They no longer read like fragments. They read like instructions. Stay upstairs. Don't open the floor. Keep the secret. Keep the secret. Keep the secret. Noah closed his eyes, whispering to himself, to the storm, to whatever listened. I'm not part of this. I didn't do it. I'm not. But the voice cut him off, firm and final. You are now. The hours after the last message crawled by like years. The storm outside never softened. It pressed against the wooden bones of the lodge until Noah thought the whole structure might buckle, until each gust felt like the mountain itself breathing down his neck. The lamp on the desk had burned so low that its flame wavered with every draft, painting the walls in nervous strokes of orange. The papers had stopped multiplying, at least for the moment, but they covered every surface in the room, the desk, the floor, even the narrow bed. Noah avoided touching them now. He stepped carefully, lamp lifted high, as though the notes were not scraps of damp paper but shards of glass that might cut deeper than skin. He told himself not to look at the words, not to read them, yet his eyes betrayed him. Fragments lodged themselves in his mind. Her hands were cold. The nails scratched the boards. Don't let them dig. He pressed his palms against his temples and whispered to himself, I didn't write them. I didn't write them. But his own voice sounded thin, unconvincing, as though he were lying to himself. The radio broke the silence again. A burst of static, then a low hum, almost like breathing. Noah froze where he stood, lamp trembling in his hand. I can hear you thinking, the voice murmured. I can feel you doubting me, but you've seen the boards move. You know it's true. Noah's knees threatened to buckle. He wanted to deny it, to shout back that it was madness, but his body betrayed him again. He remembered the pulse beneath the floor, the swell of wood under his palm. He had felt it. He had recoiled from it. The voice continued, calm now, almost coaxing. You don't have to carry it alone. Open the floor. Let the secret breathe. The lamp guttered low, shadows deepening around him, pressing close like a gathering crowd. Noah staggered back against the bed frame, his breath sharp and uneven. His mind screamed at him to leave, to plunge into the storm, but his body remained fixed. The words clung to him. He turned toward the rug. The pattern on it was old, a faded spiral of reds and browns, but in the lamplight it looked like a stain spreading outward, darker at the center. He thought he saw it ripple. He thought he heard the boards beneath sigh. No, he whispered, voice hoarse. I won't do it. The radio hissed sharp enough to rattle the glass in the lamp. The voice rose with it, no longer coaxing but furious. Don't leave me buried. Don't leave me in the dark. The notes on the desk fluttered. One slid free, landing at Noah's feet. He forced himself to look. The words sprawled across it were larger than before, gouged into the fibers. If you don't open it, I will. The lamp's flame bent low, nearly extinguished, and in the dim light Noah saw the rug shift, rising at the edge as if something beneath had pressed against it. He stumbled forward, snatched the corner, and tore it back. The boards lay exposed, warped and blackened with age. They groaned under his weight as he knelt, lamp set beside him. His fingers brushed the seams, searching, one plank lifted more easily than the others, as though it had been pulled free and replaced countless times. He should have stopped there. He should have fled. But the silence in the room demanded more, a silence so heavy it was louder than any voice. His hands worked against the board, nails splintering, breath shallow. At last it gave with a crack, sliding upward. The stench struck him first, damp, metallic, suffocating. He gagged, clutched his sleeve to his mouth, forced himself to look down. The lamp's glow trembled across a hollow space, dark earth, rotted cloth, and something pale that might have been wood, might have been bone. His stomach lurched, his eyes watered, and then he saw the eyes, wide, open, staring. The sobbing returned, not from the radio this time, but from below the floor itself, muffled and wet, vibrating against the wood. Noah clamped the board shut, heart pounding so loud he thought it would burst through his ribs. His hands shook so badly he nearly dropped the lamp. The voice in the radio sighed with relief, soft and steady. Now you see. Now you know. Noah staggered back, lamp lifted like a weapon, though it offered no comfort. The notes rustled, their words bleeding darker, sharper. He stumbled against the wall, whispering, "It isn't mine. It isn't my secret." But the voice laughed low, hollow, certain. "It is now. You opened it. You looked. You listened. You carry it." The storm struck the lodge again, shaking the walls, rattling the windows. Noah pressed his back against the boards, staring at the closed plank, the rug half torn. He could feel the weight of what lay beneath, pressing upward, hungry for breath. The radio hissed, then fell silent. The papers stilled. The lamp's flame steadied. For a moment the room was still, too still, as though everything waited for him to make the next move. He closed his eyes, tried to pray, but the words that came to his lips were not his own. "Keep the secret. Keep the secret." When he opened his eyes again, the phrase was written across every paper in the room, bleeding through layers, curling across walls, seeping into the wood like mold. The lamp sputtered once, twice, and went out. Morning never seemed to come in the mountains. The storm pressed so heavy against the windows that even the pale suggestion of dawn could not slip through. Inside the lodge, Noah sat in the dark, the lamp long extinguished, the cold seeping into his bones until he could not tell where his body ended and the wood began. The rug lay crumpled at his feet, the floorboard crooked where he had lifted it. He had tried to replace it, to press it down until it sat flush again, but it would not stay. It shifted whenever he moved near, as if something beneath breathed against it. He had given up trying. The papers covered everything now. They had spread beyond the desk and the bed, climbing the walls, plastering the window until the storm outside was hidden. Each carried words, scrawled in a dozen hands, some neat, some jagged, all spilling the same endless confession. He had stopped reading, but it did not matter. The sentences were in him now, murmuring at the edges of his thoughts. "She fell. I pushed. I didn't mean to. I locked it away. Don't let them dig." The radio hummed on the dresser, steady as a heartbeat. Its dial glowed green, constant, patient. The voice came less often now, no longer pleading, no longer desperate, but calm, almost satisfied. "You understand. You've seen. You'll keep it." Noah whispered into the dark, "I'm not part of this." But even as he said it, he felt the lie burn in his throat. He had opened the floor. He had looked. He had listened. The secret had become his, whether he wanted it or not. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time had lost its shape. He dozed and woke, shivering, only to find new papers in his lap, words etched into the skin of his palms, frost spelling out phrases against the window glass. He pressed his fist to his mouth to keep from answering the whispers, but sometimes he caught himself murmuring them back, repeating the confessions like prayers. When the knock came again, he was almost grateful. It was soft, deliberate, 3 taps against the door. He rose slowly, joints stiff, and crossed the room. His hand hesitated at the latch. The papers rustled behind him. The radio hissed. The floorboard groaned. He pulled the door open. The hallway stretched empty. No figure stood there, only the cold draft from the stairwell below. But on the threshold lay another note, crisp and white, untouched by damp. "They'll be here soon. Don't let them know." Noah bent, picked it up, stared at the words until they blurred. His breath fogged the paper. His hands shook. Somewhere below, through the storm, he thought he heard voices, distant, muffled, calling. Perhaps the caretaker, perhaps searchers from the town, perhaps nothing more than the wind shaping itself into sound. The radio crackled. "If they ask, you tell them nothing. You tell them the storm was quiet. You tell them you heard no one. You keep the secret." The floorboard thumped. Once, twice, a slow rhythm. Noah sank to his knees, pressing the paper against his chest. His lips moved without sound at first, then with a whisper that filled the silence. "I'll keep it. I'll keep it." The radio purred with static. The papers stilled. The storm outside softened, the wind sighing as though appeased. For the first time all night, the lodge was calm. Later, how much later, Noah could not say. There was a sound at the door again, different from the knocks, firmer, human, a voice calling his name, muffled by snow and wood. He rose slowly, stiff as though his body belonged to someone else, and opened the door. 2 men stood in the hall, faces red from the cold, coats heavy with frost. The caretaker was with them, eyes wide with relief. "We thought you'd frozen up here," he said. "Generators running again. Roads will be clear by evening." "You all right?" Noah stared at them. His throat worked, but no sound came. He glanced back at the room, at the papers, at the crooked floorboard. The lamp sat cold on the desk, the radio dark, nothing out of place. The caretaker frowned. "You hear me? You look pale as death." Noah swallowed. His voice came rough, broken. "The storm. It was quiet. I didn't hear a thing." The caretaker nodded, satisfied. The men moved on, their boots heavy on the stairs. Noah closed the door. He stood in the silence, staring at the floor. The rug had shifted back into place on its own, covering the seam of the board. The desk was bare. No papers, no notes. The radio unlit. For a moment he thought it had all been madness, a trick of the dark. He almost laughed. A sharp, brittle sound. He almost believed it, but when he raised his hand to wipe his face, he saw the ink stains on his skin, dark lines etched into his palm, spelling words he had not chosen. "Keep listening." His laugh caught in his throat. He sank onto the bed, pressed his hands against his ears, and waited for the silence to break again. And somewhere in the walls, faint and patient, the knocking began. Story 3. The Farmer's Almanac. The house had been empty for nearly 15 years, and it smelled like it, not of dust alone, but of damp wood and soil that had crept in through the cracks, of mice nesting between the walls, of rainwater that had stained the ceiling in spreading maps of brown. Clara pushed the door open with her shoulder, the key stiff in the lock, and the hinges answered with a long, aching groan. The kitchen was the first thing she saw. An old enamel sink, chipped at the rim, sat beneath a window clouded with grime. Shelves leaned under the weight of canning jars, some still filled with cloudy preserves no one would ever dare open. A table stood in the center of the room, its surface warped by time, its legs uneven on the creaking floor. Clara set her box down with a sigh. The storm had followed her from the highway, rolling over the fields like a herd of cattle, and the wind rattled the tin roof as though testing its hold. She had been told the place would feel like hers once she moved in, once her boots marked the floor, once she slept a night under its roof. But standing there, surrounded by shadows that belonged to someone else, she felt less like an heir and more like an intruder. Her uncle had left her the property with no explanation, a man she barely remembered, a photograph in a drawer. She knew only the outline of his life. A farmer who never married, who worked the same soil his father had worked before him, who was found one winter morning, slumped in his chair by the stove, the fire long since gone cold. They said he had no one else. They said Clara was the last of the family who might take it. She lit a lamp and carried it through the hallway. Dust motes spun in the glow, drifting like slow rain. The living room held a sagging couch, a stack of yellowed newspapers, a hunting rifle mounted above the mantel. Upstairs, the bedroom smelled of cedar and mildew, closets filled with coats whose pockets still held dry twigs and seeds. But it was the study that stopped her. The room was small, a single desk against the far wall, its surface neat beneath a film of dust. Bookshelves sagged under almanacs, weather guides, and calendars that spanned decades. A narrow window looked out over the fields bare now, the soil dark and waiting. And on the desk, in the center, lay a single book. It was an almanac, like the others, but older, its cover soft with wear, its corners chewed by time. Across the top, someone had written her uncle's name in faded ink. Beneath it, in letters sharper, darker, etched into the leather rather than written on it, was something else. Keep the land fed. Clara sat at the desk, the chair creaking beneath her, and opened the book. The pages smelled of earth and smoke. At first it seemed ordinary charts of planting seasons, phases of the moon, notes on rainfall. But as she turned further, she found markings in the margins. Not her uncle's tidy hand, but something more frantic, uneven. When the frost lingers past March, blood in the furrow makes the ground softer. Do not sow under a waning moon without an offering. The field takes back what it is owed. Her fingers tightened on the page. She flipped faster. Keep the well sealed. The voice in the water is not a neighbor. Before the first harvest, place something living beneath the roots of the oak, or the season will rot in your hands. The lamp hissed. Wind clawed at the window. Clara's mouth went dry. She closed the book too quickly. dust spiraling into the air. The words echoed in her mind, sharp as nails. She told herself they were superstitions, old farm sayings twisted into something darker by a lonely man's imagination. Farmers had always relied on folklore, on rituals half-believed, on charms passed down by those who feared the land as much as they loved it. Still, when she turned to the window, she found herself staring at the fields beyond. The soil lay bare, but it seemed to watch her, patient and expectant. The oak tree rose at the far edge, its branches skeletal against the storm, roots spreading wide into the earth. She could almost feel them beneath her feet, coiling, waiting. She set the almanac back on the desk and forced herself to laugh. The sound felt wrong in the room, too loud, too sharp. She blew out the lamp, leaving the study in shadow, and made her way downstairs. But that night, as she lay in bed listening to the wind, she dreamed of the fields. She dreamed of walking barefoot through furrows wet with something thicker than rain, the soil clinging red to her toes. The moon hung low and swollen, and from beneath the oak came a sound like something breathing through the roots, a hunger rising from the earth itself. And when she woke, heart pounding, breath caught in her throat, she found the almanac lying open on her nightstand. She had not brought it there. The storm broke by morning, leaving the fields blanketed in a crust of ice that glittered like glass. Clara stood at the kitchen window with a chipped mug of coffee, staring at the land that stretched beyond the oak tree, black soil hidden under a skin of frost. The sky was pale, the color of bone, and the air that crept in through the cracks in the window smelled sharp with winter. She had told herself she would wait before tending the ground. The soil was too cold, the season too young, but the almanac sat open on the kitchen table, its pages heavy, as though it had chosen its own place, and her eyes kept returning to a line written in the margin, the ink darker than the rest. When the frost lingers past March, blood in the furrow makes the ground softer. She read it again and again, her finger tracing the words until they felt etched into her skin. She told herself it was nonsense, old superstition. Yet when she set the mug down and pulled on her boots, she carried the almanac under her arm. The soil was harder than she expected. She dug with a spade near the edge of the field, the frozen crust resisting, the earth beneath damp and black. The air stung her cheeks, and the silence of the land pressed close, broken only by the caw of distant crows. Sweat prickled her back beneath her coat, though the air was freezing. When she finally opened a shallow furrow, she leaned on the spade, breath clouding, and looked down at the earth. It was rich, almost too rich, damp enough that it clung to the blade like tar. Her uncle had worked this land alone, year after year, and she wondered how many hours he had spent bent just like this, eyes on the soil as though it were listening. She pulled a packet of seeds from her pocket corn, left over from the county store. She poured a few into her palm, small and pale, almost weightless. She thought of the note in the almanac, blood in the furrow. She closed her hand quickly, ashamed of the chill that ran through her. She shook her head, scattering the seeds into the earth. She covered them with soil, pressed it down with her boot, and told herself it was enough. But when she stood back, she saw something she had not placed there, a small smear of red in the dirt. It looked like rust at first, a stain from the spade. But as she knelt closer, she saw it glisten in the pale light, fresh and wet. Her stomach tightened. She touched the blade of the spade clean. She checked her gloves, no cuts. Yet the stain remained, a dark bloom against the black soil. The crows cawed again, louder now, circling above the oak tree. Clara stood, spade clutched tight, and forced herself to walk back to the house. The almanac lay open on the table where she had left it. The same page, the same words, but beneath the line about blood, a new sentence had appeared, faint, but legible. You did well. The ground is listening. Clara's throat closed. She slammed the book shut and pushed it aside, her hands shaking. The sound echoed in the empty kitchen, louder than it should have been. For the rest of the day, she tried to ignore it. She unpacked the rest of her boxes, set jars on the shelves, scrubbed the sink until the enamel gleamed dull and white. But each time she passed the table, her eyes flicked to the almanac, as though it were watching her. When night came, the wind rose again. She sat in the living room with a blanket around her shoulders, staring at the wood stove that glowed faintly with embers. The house creaked and shifted. She thought she heard footsteps overhead, but when she climbed the stairs, the rooms were empty. Back in the study, The almanac waited. She had not carried it there, but there it was, resting open on the desk. The page had turned again. Before the first planting, make an offering, something that breathes, something that bleeds. Her hands trembled on the back of the chair. She wanted to tear the page out, to burn it, to scatter the ashes in the stove. But the thought of the soil outside, damp and waiting, made her hesitate. Instead, she closed the book gently, as though afraid to wake it. That night, she dreamed again. She dreamed of the oak tree, its branches stretching higher than the clouds, its roots coiling through the earth like veins. She walked barefoot across the frozen field, but the ground was soft beneath her steps, wet and red. The roots rose to meet her, wrapping around her ankles, pulling her down into the soil. She woke gasping, her sheets damp with sweat, her heartbeat so loud she thought it might wake the dead. And when she turned, the almanac was on her nightstand again. This time it lay open to a page she had not seen before. A rough sketch of the oak filled the paper, its roots tangled around something human, something curled and small, hands pressed to its chest. Beneath it, a single line in fresh ink: "Keep the land fed, or it will take for itself." Clara closed the book with trembling fingers. She lay back in the dark, listening to the creak of the house, to the whisper of the wind, to the silence of the soil beyond the window. And she wondered not if she would follow the instructions, but how long she could resist before the land demanded it. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, though not one Clara had chosen. Each morning she rose early, stoked the stove, and stepped into the brittle light to walk the fields. The ground thawed slowly, patches of frost giving way to mud that clung to her boots in heavy clumps. She scattered seeds where she could, pressed them into the furrows, told herself she was only doing what any farmer would do. But the almanac dictated her more than the season did. She found herself returning to its pages, as though they had grown magnetic. Sometimes the book lay where she had left it. Sometimes it appeared elsewhere on the kitchen table, beside her bed, even once balanced against the sink, as though waiting for her hands to dry. Each time the page was turned to some new margin note. Each time the words seemed sharper, fresher, as if written only hours before. The soil remembers what is buried. The land does not sleep without cost. At night she dreamed of the oak, its roots pressed against her windows, its branches scraped across the roof. She would wake with the impression that something had been moving through the house while she slept, dragging across the floors, rattling the cupboards. Once, she found dirt scattered in the hallway, damp footprints leading nowhere. On the fourth evening she returned from the field, mud caked to her knees, and found the study colder than the rest of the house. The lamp flame bent toward the floorboards, as though drawn by a draft. Clara knelt, pressed her palm against the wood, and felt a hollowness beneath an empty pocket of space that did not belong. She fetched a lantern and a crowbar from the shed. Her breath plumed in the air as she pried at the seams, the wood groaning like something reluctant to give. At last a section came free, revealing a dark cavity below. The smell rose first earth heavy with mildew smoke, and something sharper beneath. She lowered the lantern. Light pooled across the hollow, illuminating a bundle wrapped in burlap, bound with twine so old it had fused with the fabric. Beside it lay a book, its cover warped with damp, its leather cracked but intact. Her hands shook as she reached down, lifted the book free. It was heavier than she expected, as though the soil had soaked into its spine. She brushed mud from the cover. No title, only a symbol pressed into the leather, a circle of roots, coiling inward until they formed the shape of an eye. She carried it to the desk and opened it. The pages were thicker than ordinary paper, rough like parchment, and the ink inside was a deep brown, dried in irregular strokes that reminded her of blood. The writing was not careful. It surged across the pages in long passages, interspersed with drawings, furrows filled with red liquid, figures kneeling beneath the oak, hands raised toward a moon that never waned. One page showed a body stretched beneath tree roots, its chest open, soil pouring into it. Another depicted a group of farmers gathered in a circle, their faces blank, their arms buried up to the elbows in the ground. Beneath the sketches ran a single refrain, repeated in different hands, in different sizes. "Feed the land, or the land will feed itself." Clara turned the pages faster, heart racing. The text shifted between instructions and confessions. Some voices begged forgiveness, others boasted of harvests, too plentiful to explain. Some entries were little more than numbers, seasons, names, years, and then she reached the final section. It was written in a hand she recognized, though faintly, from old receipts tucked in the desk drawers. Her uncle's. The first year, I gave a hare. The second, a lamb. The third, a calf. The earth accepted them, but not without groaning. By the 5th year, I could not silence it with beasts alone. It wanted more. It wanted mine. I gave my blood, a little at a time, until I felt the soil breathing beneath my feet. By the 7th, the oak told me what I had always known, but tried to deny. The land remembers. The land demands. And when it hungers, it will choose if you do not. The ink trailed off into a blot. The next page was blank. Clara shut the book with shaking hands. The sound echoed in the study like a door closing. She pressed her palms against the cover, as though trying to seal the words inside, but the echo of them thrummed through her chest. Outside, the wind had stilled. The silence pressed against the windows, heavy and expectant. She looked toward the oak in the distance, its silhouette just visible against the fading sky. Its branches were still, but she thought she saw the soil around its base stir, as though something beneath had shifted. She forced the floorboard back into place, shoved the rug across it, tried to convince herself she could ignore it all. But when she left the study, lantern shaking in her hand, she found the almanac waiting on the kitchen table. It was open to a page she had not marked, a page she did not remember. At the top, in her uncle's neat handwriting, was a single line. After the first winter, give the land something you love, or it will take what it chooses. Beneath it, in darker ink, fresh and wet, another sentence had appeared. It has already chosen once. Do not let it choose again. Clara staggered back, heart hammering, lantern nearly dropping from her grasp. She thought of the uncle she had never truly known, of the farm abandoned after his death, of neighbors who had whispered but never spoken outright. She thought of how quickly the land had taken to her, how the furrows had bled when she sowed them, how the oak seemed to loom larger each night. The silence of the house deepened, as if waiting for her to answer, and Clara understood that inheritance was never free. The thaw came in slow stages, as if the land were stretching its limbs after too long beneath the frost. First, the icicles dripping from the eaves began to lengthen, drops falling steady as a clock. Then the field softened, the crust breaking into patches of mud that sucked at Clara's boots when she crossed. The snow melted into rivulets that trickled down the furrows, pooling in dark hollows where the soil drank deep. Clara tried to tell herself that the changes were ordinary, that the melt was natural, that the ground always carried this smell when winter broke, earthy, metallic, thick enough to taste on her tongue. But each time she returned to the kitchen, she found the almanac open to new pages, words she did not remember reading. The first thaw is the hungriest. Do not let the ground wait long. Roots grow restless when unfed. They reach into places they should not. Her hands trembled when she traced the sentences. She told herself she could ignore them, that she could plant as others did, water as others did, reap what came. But at night she heard it, the groan of wood as the house shifted, the low hum beneath the floorboards like something breathing. She woke with dirt on her sheets. Soil streaked across her hands, though she had not left her bed. The oak grew stranger, too. Its branches thickened with buds, though the cold had not fully lifted. Its bark split in long lines that oozed sap darker than it should have been, sap that smelled faintly of rust. The crows gathered in its limbs in dozens, watching the house with eyes that glistened like drops of oil. One morning, Clara found a hare at the edge of the field, stiff and bloodless, its body laid neatly across the furrow she had planted weeks before. The soil beneath it was damp, darker than the rest, as though it had drunk deep of what the animal left behind. She buried it quickly, hands raw from the cold, and told herself some fox had carried it there. But when she returned to the house, the almanac waited on the table, its pages damp, the ink fresh. It accepts small gifts, but not for long. That night the dream came stronger. She stood again in the field, moon swollen overhead, the oak looming larger than it should. Roots broke the soil around her feet, curling like fingers, brushing against her legs with touches too deliberate to be chance. She tried to run, but the ground sucked her down. She woke gasping, mud caked beneath her nails. The next day she forced herself into the study, back to the hidden book she had found beneath the floor. Its pages no longer shocked her. She turned them slowly, lantern close, until she found her uncle's handwriting again. I tried with beasts. It was not enough. I gave my blood, a little each week, cut into the soil by the oak. It quieted the land, for a time, but it asked for more. It always asks for more. The words blurred as her vision swam. She pressed her palms against her eyes and whispered, I won't do this. But the silence in the house was not empty. It pressed against her chest, filled her ears, seeped into her bones. She heard it in the stove when the logs cracked, in the pipes when the thawing water groaned, in the creak of the stairs when she walked alone. A whisper threaded through it all. Feed me. On the last day of the thaw, she went to the oak. The air was warmer, but the ground was soft in a way that felt wrong, loose, swollen, as if something beneath had turned it from below. She knelt at the roots, hands pressed against the bark. It pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat. Her breath shook. She pulled her hand back, clutched the spade she had brought. She had told herself she would plant. Nothing more. Just seeds. Just ordinary work. But when she pressed the blade into the earth, the soil opened too easily. Wet and dark, the smell rising sharp enough to make her gag. She tried to scatter corn as before, but the seeds slipped from her hands, falling into furrows that seemed to close on their own, swallowing them greedily. She pressed the earth flat, backed away, and told herself she had done enough. But that night, the almanac waited by her bed again. The page was blank at first. Then, slowly, as she watched, words bled across it. This is not enough. You know it is not enough. Her hands shook as she slammed the book shut. She threw it across the room, heard it strike the wall and fall silent. She buried her face in her hands, whispered to herself that it was madness, that she would leave in the morning, drive back to town, sell the land if she had to. But beneath her feet, the house creaked in a rhythm too steady to be chance. 3 slow groans, a pause, 3 more. As though something beneath the floor echoed the heartbeat of the oak. She pressed her pillow to her ears. The sound did not stop. At dawn, she woke to find the almanac beside her once more, open to a new page. A drawing sprawled across it, a woman kneeling by the oak, head bowed, hands cupped. Beneath her, roots curled up like arms, wrapping her close. And beneath the drawing, in ink still wet, a line waited. To keep the land quiet, give it one you love. Clara stared at the words until her vision blurred. She pressed the book shut, her pulse hammering. She thought of her uncle, of the way he had been found slumped by the stove. She thought of neighbors who had left, of the silence in the fields each winter. She thought of how the land had waited 15 years, patient and hungry, until she returned. Her voice broke in the empty room. I have no one, the silence answered, thick and heavy. Then, from the study below, the floorboard groaned. When she went to look, she found the rug pushed back again, the board ajar, as though something had risen in the night. She dropped to her knees, heart pounding, and peered into the hollow. The burlap bundle she had seen days before was gone. Only damp soil remained, smooth and pressed, as though something had climbed free. The almanac trembled in her hands. Words formed across the blank page once more. If you have no one else, the land will choose for you. The last frost broke in the middle of the night. Clara awoke to the sound of ice sliding from the roof in long sheets, striking the ground with a heavy crack. The air in the house was damp, warmer now, filled with the smell of wet earth. She rose from her bed and found her boots already waiting by the door, soil clinging to the soles though she had not worn them since yesterday. The almanac lay open on the kitchen table, its pages curling in the moisture, the ink bleeding at the edges as though it had been written in rain. She tried not to look, but her eyes fell to the words anyway. The thaw is done. The land waits. Give, or it takes. Her chest tightened. She slammed the book shut, but the words clung to her mind, each syllable heavy as a stone. She wanted to leave, to run down the road, back to town, back to noise and light and people who did not hear the soil whispering. She stuffed her coat into a bag, grabbed her keys, and stepped onto the porch. The truck sat half buried in mud. Its tires sagged, its frame heavy, as though the ground itself had swallowed it during the night. Clara dropped her bag, knelt in the muck, and clawed at the wheels, but her hands slipped through soil too soft, too hungry. The more she dug, the deeper the truck sank, until the earth lapped at its doors like water closing over a drowning man. She staggered back, chest heaving, and turned toward the oak. It loomed larger than ever, its branches alive with crows, their wings restless but their eyes fixed on her. The ground at its base was raw, newly disturbed, as though something beneath had turned in its sleep. She felt it from where she stood, the thrum of hunger rising through the soil. Steady, patient, inevitable. She ran back inside, slamming the door behind her, pressing her back against it. The house groaned in response, the boards bending beneath her feet. In the study, the hidden book waited. She had left it beneath the floorboards again, but she could hear it rustling, pages turning though no hand touched them. The sound filled the house like a second heartbeat. Clara pressed her hands to her ears. I won't. I can't. I have no one. The silence that followed was worse than any whisper. Then, faintly, from beneath the floor, came the sound of breathing. Slow, wet, patient. She grabbed the lantern and fled upstairs. But the almanac was already there on her nightstand. Its pages fluttered open, settling on a sketch of the oak with roots wrapped tight around a figure, faceless, hands limp at its sides. Beneath it, fresh ink spread like a wound. If you love no one, then love yourself enough to feed the land. One heart will do. Her breath caught. She stumbled back, struck the wall, nearly dropped the lantern. No, she whispered, voice raw. Not me. Not me. But the ground shook beneath the house, subtle at first, then stronger, rattling the windows, toppling the glass on her dresser. The crows screamed outside, their cries blending into one endless note. The oak groaned as though every branch strained at once. Clara fell to her knees, clutching her head, and screamed into the silence. What do you want from me? The answer came, not in words, but in rhythm, the groan of the house, the rattle of the stove, the pulse of the soil. It all said the same thing. Feed me. Her vision blurred with tears. She thought of her uncle, of his slow decline, of the years he had given before the land demanded more. She thought of the neighbors who had moved away, of the silence left behind. She thought of herself, alone in a house that was never truly hers, bound to soil that had waited 15 years for her return. And she understood. She rose slowly, lantern shaking in her grasp, and walked to the study. She pushed back the rug, pried open the floorboard, and lowered the light into the hollow. The burlap bundle had not returned, but the soil there was damp, alive, shifting as though it breathed. She set the lantern beside it and pressed her hand to the earth. It was warm. She whispered, if it must be me, then take me. The soil stirred, curling around her fingers, seeping beneath her nails. Roots brushed her skin, thin and searching, like veins reaching for blood. She closed her eyes, breath shallow, heart racing. The house sighed. The crows screamed once more, then fell silent. The lantern guttered out. Morning came gray and cold. Neighbors from the valley hiked up the road, checking on the farm after the storm. They found the house still standing, the fields dark and wet, the oak looming larger than ever. But Clara was gone. Inside, the kitchen table was bare. The almanac lay closed on the shelf, its pages clean, its margins empty. The study rug was smooth, the floorboards even. No sign they had ever been disturbed. Only in the fields was there a difference. Tiny shoots of green pushed through the soil, early for the season, too early. They glistened in the pale light, their roots stretching deep, their leaves unfurling as though eager to taste the air. The neighbors shook their heads, muttering that the land had always been strange, that it fed too well and too soon. And if one stood by the oak long enough, pressing an ear to the bark, they might hear something beneath the earth. Not roots, not wind. Something slower, heavier, a heartbeat. Story 4. The last stop on the L train. The platform smelled of wet iron and old newspapers. Marcus hunched his shoulders against the draft that blew up from the tunnel, his breath fogging in the air as the clock overhead blinked past 2:56 a.m. The L train was late again. He told himself he should have taken a cab, even if it bled his last $20. But Brooklyn was still a long ride from where he'd been drinking, and the thought of watching the meter climb while traffic lights held him captive had pushed him down the steps instead. A train was cheaper, and at this hour, he had always told himself, it was easier. The rails trembled. A distant hum slid through the tunnel, growing until the platform shook beneath his boots. Light flickered off the tiled walls as the train roared in, brakes squealing. doors sighing open. Marcus stepped inside. The car smelled of damp wool and stale air. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, washing everything in pale blue. A dozen passengers sat scattered across the seats, each one silent, faces turned slightly down but eyes wide open. They did not look at him. They did not look at each other. They stared forward, motionless, as though caught mid-thought and abandoned there. Marcus slid into a seat by the door, pulling his coat tight. He fished his phone from his pocket, thumbed the cracked screen. No service. He cursed under his breath. The train lurched forward, throwing him back against the seat. The ride stretched in silence. No chatter, no music leaking from headphones. No coughs, no shifting of coats, no sighs of the tired. Only the steady clatter of wheels on rails, the hum of the lights, the faint hiss of air. He glanced at the man across from him, dressed in a suit too neat for the hour. His eyes were wide, unblinking, fixed on nothing. The woman beside him sat the same way, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze empty. One by one, Marcus studied them. Every passenger, the same. Not asleep, not awake, just suspended. The lights above flickered. For a heartbeat, the car went dark. When they snapped back on, the passengers had shifted, each one closer to him by a single seat. Marcus froze. His chest tightened. He blinked hard, telling himself he was drunk, that his eyes had played him wrong. He rubbed his temples, glanced again. The suit man now sat 2 seats away instead of 3. The woman's knees nearly brushed his. The lights flickered again. Dark, and when the pale glow returned, the whole row leaned forward, hands resting on their knees, faces turned toward him at once. Their eyes were wide, too wide. Marcus stood abruptly, heart hammering. "The hell's wrong with you people?" His voice cracked against the silence. No one answered. They simply stared, eyes reflecting the light like glass. The train rattled through a curve, sparks flashing in the tunnel. Marcus grabbed the pole, knuckles white. He told himself to get off at the next stop. Any stop. But when the train slowed, doors opened, and the platform yawned empty. None of the passengers moved. Not a twitch, not a blink. Marcus hovered at the threshold. The empty station stretched into darkness. Tiles cracked, lights buzzing. He thought of running, but something tugged him back, some pressure that told him the platform was worse. He stepped inside again. The doors closed with a sigh. The train surged forward. This time, when the lights flickered, they stayed dark longer. Long enough for Marcus to feel his breath quicken. Long enough to hear the scrape of shoes against the floor. When the glow returned, the passengers had drawn closer still. Rows of eyes fixed on him, unblinking, shining in the pallor. He pressed himself against the door, palms slick. "Stay back," he muttered, though no one had moved in a way he could name. They were simply closer, without transition, without sound. The woman nearest him smiled faintly, her lips parting as though to speak, but no words came, only silence. Marcus slammed the emergency intercom. The speaker hissed static, then silence. No conductor's voice, no response. Only the buzz of the failing lights. He pulled his phone again. No signal, only the cracked reflection of his own face in the dark screen. His eyes wide, his breath clouding the glass. The lights flickered once more. This time, when they returned, every passenger in the car had turned their heads toward him. Perfectly aligned, perfectly still. Marcus's knees weakened. His hand slipped from the pole. The train roared on into the tunnel, faster, deeper, as though it would never stop. The wheels screamed as the train plunged through another tunnel, metal grinding against metal. The sound so sharp, Marcus thought his skull might split. He pressed his palms against the door behind him, shoulders hunched, staring at the faces across the car. They hadn't moved since the last flicker. A dozen men and women, scattered at first, but now arranged in a loose crescent, their gazes fixed on him with a precision that felt less like curiosity and more like surveillance. Their eyes caught the fluorescent buzz and held it too long, reflecting it in dull white discs. Marcus swallowed hard. His mouth was dry, his tongue heavy. He tried to laugh, just a short bark to break the silence, but the sound died in his throat, thin and pathetic. He raised his voice instead, letting it echo against the walls of the car. "Yo, conductor. Somebody." No answer. Only the steady hum of the lights and the clatter of wheels. He forced himself forward, gripping the poles as the train swayed. He moved toward the next car, his boots thudding on the rubber mats. The passengers tracked him with their eyes, heads unmoving. He gritted his teeth, refusing to look back, and shoved at the door to the adjoining car. Locked. He pulled again, harder. The metal rattled, but did not yield. He slammed his shoulder into it, but it held fast. His breath quickened. He turned. The passengers had risen. Not all at once, no sound of seats creaking, no shuffle of coats, but they were standing now, hands at their sides, faces tilted toward him. Their eyes glistened under the lights. Marcus stumbled back against the door, hands raised. "Stay back. I swear to God." The lights flickered. Darkness swallowed the car for a heartbeat. 2, 3. When they came back, the passengers were closer. Rows of them, only a few feet away, standing in silence. The woman who had smiled before was nearest, her lips parted just slightly, as though she were about to speak or breathe. Marcus's chest heaved. He shoved past her, shoulder striking hers, expecting her to topple or at least resist. But she moved like paper, weightless, her body folding away and then straightening again behind him. He staggered toward the far end of the car, slammed his fist against the windows. Outside, the tunnel rushed past in an endless blur of black concrete and steel. No platform, no station, no escape. He pounded the glass until his knuckles split, but the train roared on. Behind him, the silence thickened. He turned slowly. Every passenger now stood pressed against the poles and seats, filling the car from end to end. Their faces all turned toward him. Not one blinked, not one breathed. They simply stared, as though waiting for something he could not give. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He nearly sobbed with relief, fumbling it out, thumb shaking against the screen. No signal bar, but the display glowed with a new notification. Live. He stared. A stream was open, camera pointing forward. The image filled the screen. Him, standing in the car, wild-eyed, breathless. Behind him in the video, the passengers were smiling. He whipped around. In the car itself, their faces remained blank, still, unreadable. But in the phone's reflection, every one of them grinned, teeth sharp and endless, eyes gleaming with light that did not belong to the train. Marcus dropped the phone. It clattered across the floor. Screen cracked further, but the image remained. His reflection surrounded by those impossible smiles. The lights flickered again. This time when they returned, the passengers had moved closer still, only a foot away. A hand brushed his sleeve. Another hovered inches from his chest. Their eyes stared through him, not at him. Marcus backed toward the emergency exit at the rear of the car. His breath came in gasps, ragged, loud. His pulse thudded in his ears. He seized the red handle, yanked. Nothing. He pulled again, muscles straining. But the mechanism did not budge. The train lurched, throwing him forward into the crowd. Cold hands pressed against him, soft and unyielding, holding him upright but not restraining. Their faces loomed close, eyes wide, lips parted. For the first time, he heard them. Not words, a sound. Breathing. Dozens of breaths, slow and synchronized, filling the car in rhythm with the train's wheels. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. Marcus squeezed his eyes shut. This isn't happening. This isn't... The train screamed into another curve, lights flickering madly. He opened his eyes just long enough to see the passengers lean closer as one, their faces filling his vision, their eyes swallowing the light. And then the car plunged into darkness. The dark held longer this time. Not a flicker, not a heartbeat's pause, but an absence that stretched, swallowing the hum of the lights until Marcus wondered if the bulbs had burned out altogether. Only the wheels remained, their steady clatter echoing through the tunnel, like bones rattling in a tin coffin. He froze where he stood. The air felt thicker, warmer, laced with the smell of rust and damp fabric. He could not see the faces anymore, but he could feel them, heatless bodies surrounding him, breaths rising and falling in perfect rhythm. Inhale, exhale. The sound filled the car, louder than the train itself, pressing against his ears until he thought his skull might crack. The lights flared back once, dim, sickly, long enough for him to glimpse them. Every passenger stood inches away. Their eyes glowed faintly in the pale blue, their hands hovering near his skin but never touching, their mouths parted in silence. and then the dark swallowed them again. Marcus staggered backward, one hand against the door, the other groping along the wall for the emergency latch. His fingers found only cold metal, unyielding. He pressed his forehead to the glass window in the door, straining to see into the next car. Nothing but black, then faintly his own reflection. It should have matched him. It should have shown a man wide-eyed with fear, sweat glistening on his brow, lips parted in a silent prayer. But the reflection was wrong. The other Marcus stood calm, shoulders loose, mouth curled into a thin smile. His eyes glowed faintly, reflecting a light Marcus did not see anywhere in the car. And behind him, in the glass, the passengers were grinning again, their teeth bright, their faces stretched too wide. Marcus stumbled back from the door, chest heaving. He turned to look at the real passengers, still dark, still silent, but when the glass caught his eye again, the reflection had leaned closer. His other self pressed a hand against the inside of the window, palm flat, as though he were the one trapped on the other side. Marcus cried out, voice raw in the dark. He pounded on the glass. The reflection's lips moved, silent at first. Then the faintest whisper leaked through the seam of the door, threading into his ear like a breath. Stay. His stomach dropped. He slammed both fists against the door, but the sound was swallowed by the clatter of the wheels. When he looked again, the reflection had vanished. Only black glass stared back. The lights flickered once more. This time they steadied, buzzing faintly. The passengers had returned to their seats. Each one sat in perfect posture, hands folded, eyes fixed straight ahead, as though nothing had happened, as though they had not been pressed against him in the dark. Marcus shook his head violently. No, you were here. You were... His voice cracked. He sank into the nearest seat, chest rising and falling in panicked bursts. His phone buzzed in his pocket again. With trembling hands, he pulled it free. The screen lit with another stream. Not a recording this time. A live feed. The camera showed the inside of the train, but not as he saw it. In the feed, the passengers all turned toward him in unison, eyes gleaming, smiles wide. His own reflection sat among them now, calm, serene, as if he had been part of the group all along. The feed froze. Then the words appeared across the screen in white text, stark against the black. Next stop. Last. The phone went dark. Marcus hurled it across the car. It skidded beneath the seats and disappeared into shadow. The train lurched, faster now, the tunnel rushing by in a blur. He pressed his hands over his face, muttering, just one more stop. Just one more. The lights above him buzzed. The car seemed to breathe with the passengers, each inhale and exhale pulling him deeper into the rhythm. His eyelids grew heavy. His thoughts blurred. When he forced his eyes open again, he was staring at the window opposite his seat, and there it was again, his reflection, smiling. This time, its lips moved clearly, the words forming without sound. He read them once, twice before his breath caught. You're already here. Marcus pressed his hands against his knees, forcing himself upright. He backed toward the door, eyes locked on the glass. The reflection rose with him, movements too smooth, a second slower than his own, as though it were rehearsing. The train screeched into another curve. Sparks burst outside. For a moment the car glowed red with firelight. In that flash, Marcus saw his reflection not alone but surrounded the entire car full of grinning faces, pressed against the glass, waiting. The lights returned to pale blue. The windows showed nothing but his own shaking form. He pressed his forehead to the cool metal of the door and whispered, "This isn't real. This isn't real." But behind him, the passengers began to rise again, one by one, silent, waiting. The tunnel stretched on forever. Marcus pressed his shoulder against the cold door, the train rattling so violently he thought the bolts might shear loose. The passengers had risen again, not rushing, not lunging, only standing in that same slow inevitability, their eyes unblinking, their heads turning in unison as he moved. He staggered backward, one hand on the pole, the other clutching at air. His throat was dry, lips cracked. "What do you want from me?" he croaked, but his words were devoured by the roar of the wheels. The lights flickered once, twice. Each stutter brought them closer. They did not walk, they did not shuffle. Each blink of darkness closed the space between them. Now they stood only a breath away, their clothes brushing his, their faces level with his own. He could smell them, not sweat, Not perfume, nothing human at all. Just the faint cold of dust and stone, the dryness of places long sealed. The woman who had smiled before tilted her head, lips parting. This time a sound came, a whisper so low he thought it might be the wind. Almost there, Marcus shoved past her, stumbling toward the far end of the car. He slammed both fists against the emergency door, screaming hoarsely. The train ignored him. The tunnel blurred past in endless black. Then the intercom crackled. A voice, low and flat, filled the car. Next stop. Last stop. Every passenger turned their head toward the ceiling speaker, as though in reverence. Then, in the same motion, they turned back to Marcus. The train began to slow. The brakes screamed, sparks flashing outside the windows. For the first time since he'd boarded, Marcus saw light ahead. A platform, but it was not like any station he knew. The tiles were cracked, blackened with soot. The columns leaned as though under too much weight. Lamps burned overhead in a sickly yellow, casting long shadows across a platform empty of people. The walls were plastered with torn posters, their paper peeling, the words illegible. The train pulled in with a long sigh, doors sliding open. Marcus lunged forward, desperate. He stumbled onto the platform, his knees nearly giving. The air here was colder, sharper, smelling of wet stone and rust. He turned back once, just once, hoping to see the passengers finally disperse, but they had not moved. They still filled the car, seated neatly now, hands folded, eyes wide, all of them staring at him. The doors closed. The train did not move. The lights overhead flickered. One by one, the passengers turned their heads toward the windows. At first, they seemed to look at nothing. Then, slowly, every face pivoted back to him. Marcus stepped backward, boots scraping the cracked tiles. "No," he whispered. "No, it's over. I got off." The train's engine hummed low, like a growl. The car's lights dimmed. Behind the glass, the passengers began to rise again. Their faces pressed close to the windows, lips parted, breath fogging the glass. The doors sighed open once more. The platform was no longer empty. Shadows stretched across it, long and thin, peeling themselves free from the walls. They shaped into figures, half-formed, their eyes glistening in the weak light. Marcus stumbled back farther, nearly tripping on the edge of the platform. The intercom crackled again, its voice flat, deliberate. "End of the line. Everyone off." "Oh." The passengers stepped out, not in a rush, not in a crowd. One by one, deliberate, silent. Their shoes struck the tiles without sound. Their eyes stayed on Marcus, unblinking. He spun, desperate, searching for stairs, for an exit, but the platform stretched into darkness in both directions. No signs, no arrows, no way out. Only the tunnel yawning behind him, deeper into black. The first passenger stopped a few feet away. The woman. She smiled again, thin and patient. "Stay," she whispered. Marcus shook his head violently, backing toward the tunnel's mouth. His pulse thundered in his ears. "No, I'm not staying here." But the others had spread across the platform now, forming a semicircle. Their eyes glowed faintly in the sick light, their breaths rising and falling in that same perfect rhythm. The intercom clicked once more. Final stop. No return service. The train's doors slammed shut. Sparks spat from beneath the wheels. With a low groan, the cars pulled forward, sliding into the tunnel, leaving Marcus alone on the platform with the passengers who no longer belonged to the train. The silence thickened. The woman stepped closer, her shoes whispering against the tile. Marcus turned and ran into the tunnel, his breath ragged, his boots slamming against the gravel. The dark swallowed him. Behind him, the sound followed. Dozens of footsteps, in perfect rhythm. The tunnel swallowed Marcus whole. The air was damp, reeking of mold and copper, every breath scraping his throat raw. His boots pounded against the gravel, crunching glass shards and old bolts scattered like teeth along the track bed. Behind him, the footsteps never faltered, dozens of them, soft but synchronized, rising and falling with a rhythm too steady, too deliberate to belong to anything human. He ran harder, lungs burning, vision blurring. The light from the station shrank behind him until it was nothing but a faint smear. Ahead, only darkness stretched. He fumbled for his phone, desperate for its glow. But when he yanked it free, the screen lit without his touch. It showed the live feed again. Himself, running through the tunnel, eyes wild, chest heaving. But in the stream, he was not alone. On either side of him, passengers kept pace, their faces turned toward him, smiling. Their feet did not touch the ground, their bodies gliding effortlessly in step with his frantic sprint. Marcus hurled the phone into the dark, a ragged scream tearing from his chest. It clattered against the wall, the light dying, but the image remained in his mind. The footsteps grew louder, closer. He stumbled, caught himself on the wall. The concrete was slick, damp with condensation. His hand came away smeared with something dark. In the faint glimmer of overhead bulbs dead but pulsing once as if waking, he saw the smear glisten red. Blood. The lights flickered, fully awake for a breath, casting the tunnel in a pale, jaundiced glow. And in that instant, he saw them. The passengers stretched down the length of the tunnel, rows upon rows, standing shoulder to shoulder, faces pale, eyes wide, lips parted in silent invitation. They filled the darkness like wallpaper peeling itself loose, infinite and repeating. Marcus froze. His chest heaved. His heart hammered so hard he thought it might burst free. He stumbled backward, tripping over the track. His ankle twisted, sending pain lancing up his leg. He collapsed onto the gravel, gasping. The nearest passenger leaned forward. The woman, the same one who had smiled first. She crouched beside him, her movements fluid, almost graceful, and lowered her face to his ear. "You missed your stop," she whispered. Her breath was cold, colder than the tunnel air, and it slid down his spine like ice water. Marcus shoved at her, scrambling to his feet, half running, half limping deeper into the tunnel. His ankle screamed with each step, but adrenaline carried him. The tunnel sloped downward. The air thickened. He realized he was no longer running parallel to the city, but deeper beneath it, as though the train had carried him not just forward, but down, into a place not meant for passengers. He stumbled into another station. This one was smaller, forgotten. The tiles were shattered, the benches rusted through, the tracks ending in a wall of black stone. No signs, no exits, just a station that did not exist on any map. The train waited there, not the one he had boarded, but something older. Its cars were steel gray, streaked with rust, windows black with grime. The doors stood open, yawning. Inside, the lights glowed faintly, revealing rows of seats. Each one was filled. Passengers. They sat in silence, eyes wide, faces pale, their heads turned in perfect unison as Marcus stepped onto the platform. His knees weakened. He staggered back, but the crowd from the tunnel had caught up, spilling into the station, forming a semicircle behind him. They did not touch him, did not speak, but their presence pressed against his skin, a wall of silence that left no room to breathe. The intercom crackled overhead. "Boarding now. Final service." Marcus shook his head violently. "No, I'm not one of you." The passengers in the train car smiled, one by one, a ripple of grins spreading through them like a contagion. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He yanked it free, the screen lit with a single line of text. "Welcome back, Marcus." His breath caught. He dropped the phone, letting it shatter on the tiles. His legs gave out, and he sank to his knees. The crowd pressed closer. The woman stepped forward again. She knelt beside him, her pale hand hovering just above his arm. "Just sit down," she whispered. "It's easier once you sit down." The train's lights brightened. The doors hissed, waiting. Marcus staggered upright, swaying on his twisted ankle. He took one step back, then another, until his shoulders struck the edge of the platform. The tunnel gaped behind him, black and endless. The train loomed before him, filled with smiling faces. His chest heaved. His vision swam. He whispered, "No more. No more." The intercom crackled once more, final and flat. Doors closing. The passengers moved as one. Marcus screamed. Morning came. The L train ran its usual route, commuters crowding the cars, eyes down, phones in hand, coffee steaming in paper cups. The stations bustled with noise, the city above waking as it always had. But in one control room, a security guard sipped his stale coffee and frowned at the grainy footage playing across his monitor. The camera showed a car from the early hours of the morning. A single man sat in the corner seat, his head tilted slightly, his hands folded neatly in his lap. His eyes were open, too wide. His lips curled faintly at the edges. The guard leaned closer, muttering to himself. Strange one. Then he clicked away to another feed. On the screen he left behind, the man in the corner seat raised his head, turning toward the camera. His mouth opened, and he smiled. Story 5. The Locksmith's Legacy. The shop smelled of brass and oil. A thin tang of metal dust clung to the air, catching in the throat, settling on the shelves where dozens of blank keys hung in neat rows. Elias had grown used to it. He could tell what kind of metal he was working with by scent alone: zinc sharp, brass sweet, steel flat and cold. Tonight, though, the air felt heavier, as if the walls themselves had exhaled and decided not to inhale again. The rain outside tapped against the front window, streaking the glass so the neon sign reflected twice over. Locksmith, 24 hours. The hum of the transformer buzzed steady, mixing with the faint drip of water from his coat still drying on the rack. He was alone, as usual, though sometimes he imagined he could hear footsteps in the aisles behind him, the echo of his grandfather's pace. The old man had owned this shop for 50 years before Elias inherited it. The benches were still scarred from his tools, the drawers labeled in his looping handwriting, and tucked in the back, beneath a box of corroded padlocks, Elias had found something else, a small tin case worn at the edges, heavy despite its size. He hadn't opened it right away. He had carried it upstairs, set it on his kitchen table, and stared at it for nearly an hour. The lid was etched with a pattern unlike anything he had seen before, not floral, not geometric, something in between, like roots tangled into knots. When he finally pried it open, his breath had caught. Inside lay a single key. It was silver, not the cheap nickel kind, but true silver, tarnished with age yet gleaming faintly under the lamp. Its bow was shaped into a spiral that led inward to a hollow center, and its shaft carried grooves he had never seen on any commercial design. They did not run straight, but curled and crossed, etched with impossible precision. Elias had run his finger along the cuts and felt a chill spread into his skin, as though the grooves were deeper than they appeared, as though they reached past the surface into something beneath. Now, weeks later, he still kept the key in his pocket while he worked, telling himself it was only curiosity. But every time he touched it, a subtle vibration hummed through the metal, faint as a cat's purr, noticeable only when the shop had gone utterly still. The bell above the door chimed. Elias startled, nearly dropping the file in his hand. He wiped his palms on his apron and turned. A man stood in the doorway, rain dripping from his coat. His face was pale, hair plastered to his forehead. He carried something wrapped in cloth. "Are you still open?" the man asked. His voice was hoarse, as though he hadn't spoken for hours. "Always," Elias said, forcing a smile. "What do you need?" The man stepped forward, placed the bundle on the counter, and peeled the cloth away. It was a padlock, old, iron, scarred with rust. Its shackle stood upright, frozen in the open position. Elias frowned. "It's already unlocked." The man shook his head. "It won't close." Elias examined it. The lock's body was etched faintly, though the rust obscured the details. He pressed the shackle down. It resisted, then sprang back, refusing to catch. He tried again, harder. The mechanism inside rattled, dry and hollow. "Where did you get this?" Elias asked. The man's eyes flicked toward the rain-smeared window. "Does it matter?" Elias sighed. "I'll see what I can do." He carried the padlock to his bench, set it under the lamp, and fetched a pick. He probed the keyway, expecting corrosion, but the pins inside clicked too smoothly, too quickly. Not broken. Not jammed. More like wrong. The grooves in the cylinder did not align with any standard he knew. They spiraled inward, twisted on themselves, refusing to let the shackle seat. He tried different angles, different tools. Nothing. At last, frustration prickling his skin, he slipped a hand into his pocket. His fingers found the silver key. It hummed faintly, as though aware. "No way," Elias whispered. Still, he brought it out. He turned it under the lamp. The grooves on the padlock matched the strange cuts in the key, curling, spiraling. His breath caught. Against every instinct, he slid the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a chill swept across the room. The lamp's bulb flickered, buzzing. Elias felt pressure against his chest, as if the air itself had thickened. He turned the key. The shackle snapped shut with a metallic clack. The man at the counter shuddered violently. His eyes widened, then closed. He gripped the counter as though steadying himself against a great weight. When he opened his eyes again, they glistened with something like terror. "You shouldn't have done that," he whispered. Elias pulled the key free, heart hammering. "You asked me to fix it. I didn't ask you to seal it." The man's voice cracked. He wrapped the lock in the cloth with trembling hands. "You don't know what you've touched." Before Elias could reply, the man snatched the bundle and bolted into the rain, the bell jangling wildly behind him. The shop fell silent. Elias stood frozen, the key cold in his palm. For a long moment he could not move, could not breathe. Then faintly, from the drawer behind him, another lock rattled. He turned slowly. The drawer was shut, yet the sound came again, a faint, metallic clink, as though something inside shifted, waiting. Elias gripped the silver key tighter, its grooves biting into his skin, and for the first time since he inherited the shop, he wondered if his grandfather's legacy had never been business at all. The rain did not stop for 3 days. It drummed against the shop windows, streaking the neon sign until the letters bled into one another, lock, SMTH, like something incomplete. Elias worked as usual, duplicating keys for landlords, replacing broken latches for delivery drivers, selling spare padlocks to strangers who hardly looked him in the eye. Business was steady enough, but his mind lingered on the silver key. Each night he set it on the workbench, staring at its spiral bow under the lamp. Its grooves caught the light strangely, throwing shadows deeper than they should have been. Sometimes, when the rain fell hardest, he swore the key vibrated faintly, as though in sympathy with the storm. He tried not to think of the man who had left with the iron padlocks sealed, but when the shop grew quiet, Elias imagined he could still hear the echo of that clack, not a mechanical sound, not merely steel against steel, but something final, as though a door had shut somewhere far beyond the shop. On the 4th night, another customer arrived. The bell above the door rang soft this time, almost reluctant. A woman stepped in, her umbrella dripping, her coat worn thin. She cradled something in her hands, wrapped in a towel. "You fix locks?" she asked. Elias nodded. "That's the idea." She laid the bundle on the counter and unwrapped it. Inside was a boxwood, carved with symbols too faded to read. A hasp hung from its lid, attached to a lock, not of iron but of brass, so tarnished it looked green. The shackle stood ajar, frozen upright. "It won't close," she said softly. Elias felt a cold knot in his stomach. The words were the same as the man's days before. He examined the lock, noting the familiar wrongness. Grooves spiraled where they should have aligned straight, pins that clicked too smoothly, too quickly. He fetched a file, tested the keyway. Nothing held, and again, against his will, his hand drifted to his pocket. The silver key was cold against his fingertips, though he had not touched it since morning. He slid it free. The woman's eyes widened faintly, as though she recognized it, but she said nothing. Elias hesitated only a moment before pressing the key into the lock. It slid home with unnatural ease. The grooves aligned, like teeth meeting bone. He turned. The lock snapped shut with a sharp clack. The woman flinched. Her hands trembled as she snatched the box back, pressing it to her chest. Her lips moved, but no sound emerged. She gave Elias a long, hollow look, half gratitude, half dread, then turned and hurried into the rain. The bell jangled. Silence returned, and then Elias heard it, the faint metallic shuffle of his drawers again. Locks rattling softly, tumblers clicking without touch. He turned slowly toward them, heart hammering. One drawer slid open a finger's width. Inside, the padlocks shifted against each other like restless bones. Elias slammed it shut, his breath ragged. That night, he dreamed of locks. They lined the walls of his shop, thousands of them, each suspended without chain or door. They hung in the air, their shackles open, waiting. The silver key burned in his hand, heavy, vibrating with hunger. As he turned in the dream, every lock snapped shut at once. The sound a single, thunderous clack that reverberated in his chest. He woke gasping, sweat cold on his skin. The key lay on his nightstand, though he had left it downstairs. The next day, a third customer arrived. An old man this time, stooped, coat too large for his frame. He carried no bundle, only an object cupped bare in his hands. A padlock of bronze, pitted and scarred, its shackle quivering faintly, though no one touched it. "It won't stay closed," he murmured. His eyes were cloudy, pale, but fixed sharply on Elias. "I think you know how to help." Elias's throat tightened. He wanted to refuse, to say he had never seen such locks before, that his work was ordinary, commercial. But the key in his pocket thrummed faintly, answering before he could. He brought it out. The old man nodded slowly, as though confirming some private suspicion. Elias slid the key into the lock, turned. Clack. The old man shuddered, as though a weight had lifted or shifted. He whispered something Elias did not catch, then set the sealed lock on the counter and walked out without taking it. Elias stared at it. The lock sat heavy, silent, its shackle frozen in place. He did not want to touch it, but his hand drifted closer, as if drawn. When his fingers brushed the brass, a chill raced up his arm. Images flooded his mind, doors without hinges, hallways that led nowhere, shadows pressed tight against walls. He gasped and yanked his hand back. The lock sat inert once more, ordinary. That night, Elias did not sleep. He sat in the shop's back room, the silver key on the table before him, the abandoned lock beside it. He stared until dawn, listening to the faint hum of metal, the whisper of tumblers shifting in drawers that should have been still. And when the sun finally rose, pale and thin behind the rain, Elias understood something his grandfather had never told him. The key was not made to open, it was made to seal. And now the locks were finding their way back. The first one appeared on his own door. Elias had locked up the shop after midnight, his hands trembling with exhaustion, the silver key heavy in his pocket like an anchor. He climbed the narrow stairs to the apartment above, kicked off his boots, and reached for the deadbolt. But the lock was not his. The brass faceplate looked older, its edges warped, its keyway carved with spirals he had never installed. The shackle of a padlock hung through the bolt itself, impossibly fused, as though it had grown out of the door. Its bow was etched with the same pattern as the silver key. Elias froze. He had not put it there. He had never seen it before, yet it gleamed faintly in the dim hall light, waiting. His hand drifted to his pocket. The silver key pulsed faintly, almost warm. "No," he whispered. "Not this one." "Ems." He turned and slept downstairs, slumped in the back room chair, his coat wrapped around him. The next day, another appeared, this time on the supply cabinet in the shop. He had gone to fetch a file, only to find a rusted padlock hanging through the latch. It was already closed, its shackle snapped tight. He tried his ring of ordinary keys. None fit. He tried picks. The pins inside clicked once, then fell silent, as if the lock had no mechanism at all. He felt the silver key vibrating in his pocket again. Eager, impatient, Elias backed away, heart hammering. He left the cabinet sealed, though it meant working without tools he had used daily. By the third night, the sound of rattling locks filled the shop. Not loud, not constant, but faint and persistent. The clink of tumblers shifting, the tick of springs resetting. Drawers trembled in the dark. Padlocks on the display wall twisted against their hooks, clattering softly. Elias sat at the bench, head in his hands, whispering to himself, "You're losing it. You're tired. That's all." But when he lifted his head, the silver key was already in the lock of the drawer nearest him, though he had no memory of placing it there. On the fifth day, a boy appeared at the door. He couldn't have been more than 12, his hair plastered flat by the rain. He carried nothing in his hands. He just stood there, dripping onto the floor, staring at Elias. "Do you fix them?" the boy asked. His voice was small, precise, too calm for his age. "Fix what?" Elias managed. The boy opened his coat. Inside, dozens of tiny padlocks hung from threads stitched into the lining. They dangled against each other, chiming softly like bells. None were closed. Every shackle stood upright, trembling faintly as though caught in an invisible breeze. Elias staggered back, bile rising in his throat. Where did you get those?" The boy tilted his head. "They don't stay shut. You're supposed to make them stay shut." His small hands lifted one lock free, placed it on the counter. Elias recognized the spiraling grooves immediately. The silver key thrummed like a heartbeat. "No," Elias whispered. "Not this time. Take it away." The boy only stared, his eyes wide, pupils pinpricks. Then, slowly, he smiled. "If you don't, it opens." The words chilled Elias deeper than any night wind. With shaking hands, he drew out the silver key. He pressed it into the lock. It slid home. Clack. The boy shuddered once, then straightened. He gathered the lock, returned it to the lining of his coat. He said nothing more, only turned, opened the door, and vanished into the rain. The bell above the door stilled. The shop went silent. That night, Elias dreamed again. The locks lined the walls as before, thousands of them, their shackles upright, waiting. But this time, one by one, they snapped shut as he turned the silver key, their echoes reverberating like gunshots. Each clack made the world darker, narrower, until he stood alone in a void filled only with sealed locks. At the very center hung a door, massive, iron, its hinges buried in shadow, its surface crawled with carvings, spirals deeper than the eye could follow. Chains looped across it, padlocks fused to steel, all of them open. The silver key blazed hot in his hand. He woke gasping, sweat streaming. His palm blistered as though burned. On his nightstand lay a new padlock, small, brass, shackle open. He had not brought it there. The next morning, Elias found locks on every door in the shop, on the register, on the bathroom cabinet, on the windows, fused to the frames, their shackles rattling softly in the draft. All stood open, waiting. He staggered from one to the next, muttering, "No, no, no." But the silver key pulsed harder with each step, demanding use. At last he collapsed at his bench, head in his hands, the key biting into his palm. The drawers rattled all at once. One slid open fully, spilling a half-dozen locks across the floor. They clattered, bounced, rolled until they ringed his chair. Everyone stood open. Elias whispered into the silence, his voice hoarse. "What happens if I don't seal them?" The locks shivered, and from the walls, faint but clear, came a sound he had never wanted to hear. Breathing, slow, heavy, patient, as though something waited just beyond the sealed doors, ready to push through if given the smallest chance. Elias clutched the key, his knuckles white, and for the first time he understood. The locks were not tools. They were warnings, and his grandfather's legacy was not business, not craft, but containment. The sound grew worse each night. At first it had been a faint rattling, like tumblers shifting on their own. Now it was breathing. Thick, deliberate breaths that rose from the floorboards, rattled the display shelves, and curled into the back of Elias's skull until he could no longer tell if it came from the locks or from himself. The shop reeked of oil and iron. Dozens of padlocks now dotted the counters, the doors, the walls. They weren't his inventory. He hadn't bought them, hadn't made them. They appeared in silence, always open, always waiting. He had stopped trying to hide them. The silver key wanted them shut, and each time he turned it, the world seemed to steady for a moment before another lock arrived. On the seventh night, he heard the first voice. It came from the supply cabinet, the one with the rusted padlock he had refused to touch. He was dozing at the bench, cheek against his arm, when the whisper threaded through the dark. "Elias." He jolted upright, heart hammering. The cabinet rattled. The lock shackle quivered, clicking faintly, as though something inside was pushing from the other side. He gripped the silver key so tightly its spiral bow cut into his palm. "Not yet," he whispered. "Not you." The whisper pressed harder, the syllables slipping through the keyhole. "Let me breathe." The drawers trembled in answer, every lock rattling at once like bones in a box. The sound rose into a low moan, then fell silent. Elias didn't sleep again that night. The next day, a customer arrived. Not a stranger. A woman he recognized, Mrs. Alvarez, who lived 2 streets over. She looked pale, her hands shaking as she placed something wrapped in cloth on the counter. "It's from my cellar," she said. "The door won't stay closed. Every night I hear it slam open again." Elias unwrapped the bundle. Another lock. Iron, pitted, its shackle rusted but upright. The grooves in its body curled in the same impossible spiral. He stared at it, throat dry. "Why bring it here?" She looked at him as though he were the only one who could understand. "Because my father told me. Your grandfather helped once. He said you were the last locksmith, the one who knew how to keep things sealed." Her eyes glistened. "Please." Elias hesitated, but the key in his pocket vibrated. Eager, he slid it out, turned it once in the lock. Clack. Mrs. Alvarez flinched. Tears welled in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, snatching the lock back, clutching it to her chest. She fled into the rain, the bell jangling behind her. Elias stood frozen, the silver key cold now, drained. He turned back toward the shop. The cabinet rattled again, louder. The whisper rose. "Elias, open me." By midnight, the shop was alive. Locks trembled on their hooks, clattering against each other in restless chains. The drawers shook violently, threatening to spill their contents. The cabinet thudded as though fists pounded from within. Elias pressed himself against the bench, the key clutched in both hands, knuckles white. "You stay shut," he muttered. "All of you. That's the rule." The breathing answered him, louder now, layered with tones too deep to belong to a single throat. The cabinet shuddered. The lock groaned. And then, with a sound like tearing metal, the shackles sprang open. The lock dangled loose, swinging. Elias's blood ran cold. He lunged forward, jamming the silver key into the keyway. But before he could turn it, something pressed against the door from the inside. The wood bowed outward. Cracks raced through the grain. A voice poured through, not a whisper this time, but a chorus, hollow and metallic. "We are not meant to stay." "Oh." Elias twisted the key with all his strength. Clack. The lock slammed shut. The cabinet stilled. The voices cut off mid-breath. He collapsed to his knees, chest heaving. His ears rang with the echo of the clack, louder than any he had heard before, as if it had sealed not just a door but an entire cavern behind it. The silence that followed was absolute. Until the phone rang, Elias staggered to his feet, answering with shaking hands. A voice hissed through the line, faint, distorted. "You can't seal them all." The line went dead. Elias stared at the receiver, his pulse thundering. He turned slowly toward the shop. The drawers had stopped rattling. The locks hung still. The air was heavy, waiting. And then, from upstairs, he heard it. A click. He froze. The sound had come from his apartment door, the one that had grown its own lock days ago. Slowly, deliberately, the shackle was lifting. He raced up the stairs, two at a time, silver key clutched so tight it cut into his flesh. At the top, his apartment door loomed in the dim light. The padlock hung there, its shackle rising inch by inch, as though lifted by invisible fingers. The breathing was louder here. Each inhale made the walls tremble. Each exhale iced the back of his neck. "No," Elias whispered, pressing the key into the lock. His hands shook. He turned. The shackle slammed down with a clack. The breathing stopped. Silence. For a moment he thought he had won. But as he stepped back, the key still in the lock, he realized his mistake. It wouldn't come out. The silver key was stuck, fused in place, its grooves locked deep. He pulled until his hands blistered, but it did not move. And as he stared, his reflection swam across the brass faceplate. Not his tired eyes, not his grimace. His grandfather, smiling. The silver key would not let go. Elias gripped it with both hands, yanking until his palms blistered, until his breath came ragged in the dark stairwell. The grooves seemed to have grown roots inside the lock, fused as if they had never been separate. The more he pulled, the colder the metal burned, as though his skin itself were freezing into the bow of the key. "Let me out," a voice whispered from the other side of the door. It wasn't the faint breathing anymore. It was speech layered, metallic, voices braided together until they formed a single note. His grandfather's tone swam inside it, familiar and foreign at once. "You're not strong enough," it hissed. "You'll never seal them all." Elias pressed his forehead against the door, teeth clenched. "I'm not opening you." The door rattled under his weight, straining outward as though something inside was pushing against it. The wood groaned, hinges whining. The padlock shivered, the shackle lifting despite the key jammed inside. "No," Elias snarled, twisting harder. His arm burned, muscles tearing. With a final heave, he forced the shackle back down. Clack. The sound shook the hallway, reverberating down through the floorboards, into the shop below, into the drawers and shelves where hundreds of locks answered at once. They all snapped shut in unison, the noise like thunder rolling through metal. The house went still. Elias staggered back, hands raw and bleeding. The key was still in place, but now it pulsed faintly, one beat, then another, a heartbeat, not his own. He barely slept after that. When he closed his eyes, he saw doors, endless doors, hanging in black space, each with a lock waiting. Some were small and ordinary. Others were massive, iron-plated, their hinges taller than he was. He wandered among them with the silver key, turning, sealing, listening to the clack echo until the dream blurred into waking. By morning, the shop had changed. Every surface bristled with locks. The shelves sagged under their weight. The walls gleamed with brass and iron. Even the neon sign outside buzzed faintly. Its hum not electricity, but the faint rattle of tumblers inside. And still they came. A man dragging a trunk with hinges that refused to hold. A woman clutching a necklace with a clasp that would not close. A boy with a toy box bound by chains, each shackle ajar. They all wanted the same thing, for Elias to shut them, to seal them. The silver key always fit. Each turn drained him more. The metal grew heavier, the grooves digging deeper into his flesh. He no longer bothered to put it away. It hung from his hand constantly, humming, alive. On the 12th night, the locks began to whisper in unison. Not words, not yet, only a low chant, tumblers clicking like teeth, shackles tapping against wood in a rhythm too steady to ignore. Elias sat in the dark shop, lantern guttering low, listening. His grandfather's chair creaked across from him, though it was empty. "You didn't tell me," Elias muttered into the silence. His voice was hoarse. "You never told me what this really was." The locks rattled harder. "You left it for me. You wanted me to carry it, to finish what you couldn't." The silver key pulsed in his palm, answering with a steady thrum. "You wanted me to replace you." The reflection on the key's spiral bow shifted. For an instant, it wasn't Elias staring back, but the old man's eyes, hollow and calm. At dawn, Elias walked through the shop one last time. He touched each drawer, each hook, each cabinet now sealed. The locks gleamed faintly in the morning light, their shackles shut, their bodies still. He descended into the cellar. It was the only place he hadn't looked, the only place untouched. The door at the bottom of the stairs was newer than the house itself. Steel plates bolted into the stone, chains wrapped across it in thick loops. Padlocks studded every link, their shackles upright, every one of them waiting. The breathing from behind it was louder than ever. Each inhale bent the chains outward. Each exhale frosted the air, mist curling in the lantern glow. The silver key vibrated violently in his hand. He stared at the door for a long time. His heartbeat matched the rhythm of the locks. Clack, clack, clack. Finally, he whispered, "If I seal this one, what happens to me?" No answer. Only the hiss of breath from beyond, steady and patient. He pressed the key into the largest lock. The grooves aligned. He twisted. Clack. The chains tightened. The door groaned. The breathing stopped. Elias collapsed to his knees. The key fused to his palm, burning cold. He gasped, the world spinning. His vision dimmed. Weeks later, neighbors said the locksmith shop had gone quiet. No bell above the door. No glow from the neon sign. When they finally forced their way in, the counters were empty, the drawers sealed, every cabinet bound with unfamiliar locks. Their shackles snapped shut. Of Elias, there was no trace, but on the bench lay the silver key, its spiral bow glistening faintly. When one of the neighbors touched it, just for a second, they swore it pulsed like a heartbeat. And in the cellar, behind the door layered with chains, something exhaled once, soft as dust. Story 6. The Black Patch. The stairs creaked the same way they always had, but George paused halfway up, gripping the banister until his knuckles whitened. He was alone in the house, that much he knew. His wife was visiting her sister, his son away at college. The walls carried only his breath, the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the groan of timber settling with the autumn wind. And yet, from the corner of his eye, there was something standing at the top of the stairs. Not a man, not a shadow, not anything with form, only a patch black, featureless, flat against the air, as though someone had pressed a brush of ink onto the world and forgotten to finish the stroke. George turned his head, quickly, sharply. The landing was empty, just the narrow hallway, with its framed photographs, and the lamp still burning in his bedroom. But when he looked forward again, climbing another step, the patch was there, in his periphery once more. A blot, A flaw. It did not move. It did not waver. It only was. George was a man of habits, and habits had always kept his mind steady. He rose at 6. He brewed coffee, 1 spoon of sugar, 2 of cream. He read the paper at the same kitchen table where his father had once read his, the radio humming faintly in the background. Retirement had made the rituals heavier, but still they gave him shape. Without them, the nights stretched too long. He told himself the patch was only fatigue. Insomnia again. He hadn't slept well since leaving the force. The years of night shifts had carved his rhythms hollow, left him awake at 2, 3, 4, staring at ceilings that pressed closer with every hour. But the patch remained. At first it came only at the top of the stairs, then by the kitchen doorway, later, beside the recliner where he watched late-night reruns, always at the edge of sight, always still. When he turned his head, there was nothing. But when he looked away there, on the second week, he mentioned it to his daughter over the phone. "It's just my eyes," he said, trying for a chuckle. "You know, floaters, shadows, old age." She hesitated. "Dad, are you sure? You sound..." "I'm fine." His voice came out sharper than intended. "I've seen worse things." And he had. The alleys where knives flashed. The apartments where silence covered bruises. The morgue. The calls that came at 2 in the morning, when the city was at its cruelest. He had seen faces twisted by violence, eyes clouded by death. He had told himself those were the only ghosts he carried. But this one, this was different. This was not memory. This was here. One night he woke gasping, the sheets damp with sweat. The clock glowed 3:17 a.m. He sat up, rubbed his face, tried to steady his breathing. The hallway lamp was still on. It should have been reassuring. But at the edge of the glow, by the doorframe, the patch waited. It was darker than shadow. The light bent around it, as though refusing to touch. The air near it felt colder, not by degrees but by intent, like an indrawn breath. George froze, heart pounding. His instincts, the same that had carried him through decades of night patrols, told him not to move, not to speak. Predators thrived on reaction. He closed his eyes, counted backward from 10. When he opened them, the patch was gone. He did not sleep again. The days blurred. Coffee tasted flat. The paper's words drifted into nonsense. The radio's hum grated like static. Everywhere he turned, the patch followed. At the grocery store, by the freezer aisle, on the sidewalk, just beyond the hedge, in the reflection of his car window, where for a split second it seemed taller, broader, as if standing directly behind him. He tried ignoring it. He tried confronting it. Once he whispered, low and sharp, "What do you want?" No answer. Only silence thick enough to choke. And yet, the patch stayed. On the 15th night, George sat in his recliner, the television's glow flickering across his tired face. He had poured himself a whiskey but had not touched it. The house was silent except for the low murmur of actors on the screen. He knew the patch was in the hallway again. He could feel the weight of its stillness pressing against his skin. He refused to look. He kept his eyes on the screen, even as the picture blurred, even as tears pricked the corners of his vision from the effort. The silence deepened. His chest rose and fell. Then, from the hallway, the floor creaked. Not the way wood groans beneath a house's shifting weight. No, this was different. This was pressure. A footstep. George did not move. He did not breathe. He sat frozen in the recliner as the creak faded back into silence. He told himself it was the house, that his mind had shaped the sound from fear, but he could still feel it, the presence at the edge of sight. Thicker, darker, closer. He whispered into the empty room, "You don't belong here." The whiskey glass on the table rattled, and for the first time, George thought the patch might not be watching. It might be waiting. The phone rang just past noon. George nearly dropped his coffee mug as he lunged for it, grateful for the sound of another voice breaking through the silence. It was his wife. She had extended her stay with her sister, but now she spoke in that clipped, careful tone she used when she was trying not to worry him. "You sound tired," she said. "I am," George admitted. "I haven't been sleeping right." She hesitated. "The house. It feels strange lately, even over the phone." He forced a laugh. "It's just quiet. Quieter than you remember, maybe." But he could tell from her silence that she didn't believe him. That evening, his daughter visited. She bustled in with grocery bags, insisting he wasn't eating enough. She clattered around the kitchen while George sat at the table, pretending to read the paper. "Dad," she said suddenly, her voice too sharp for casualness. "What's in the hallway?" The newspaper slid from his hands. He looked up. "What do you mean? I thought I saw something when I came in. Just a shadow, but it wasn't moving like shadows do." It was. She shook her head, frustrated with her own words, like a blot, just standing there. George stared at her, mouth dry. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel insane. "You saw it too," he whispered. His daughter frowned, biting her lip. "So it's real? I thought maybe—" "It's real," George said flatly. He gripped the edge of the table until the wood dug into his palms, and it doesn't go away. The silence between them deepened, thicker than before. She busied herself with the groceries, but he saw how her hands shook when she reached for the fridge. 2 days later, his wife returned. The house felt lighter with her presence, filled with the ordinary noises of pots clanging, drawers opening, the television playing too loud. But at night, as they climbed the stairs together, she froze halfway up. "George," she whispered, clutching his arm. "Do you see that?" He didn't want to look, but his eyes betrayed him, sliding toward the landing. There it was. The patch stood motionless at the top, darker than the dark around it. "I've been seeing it for weeks," George said hoarsely. "I thought it was me, thought it was my eyes. But," she gripped his sleeve tighter, "it's not just you." From then on, they avoided speaking of it directly. It hovered in their conversations like static, unsaid but present. She left more lights on than usual. He stopped watching television in the recliner, claiming the shows had gone stale, but really he couldn't bear the hallway's silence pressing against him. Even their daughter, when she called, chose her words carefully. "Have you noticed anything?" she would ask, her voice low. "Yes," George always said. "Nothing more." What else was there to say? One night, the three of them sat together after dinner. The dishes were still on the table, the lamp buzzing faintly overhead. Their daughter's little boy, a wiry 6-year-old with restless hands, raced toy cars across the wood surface. He stopped suddenly, staring toward the hallway. "Grandpa," he said, "who's that man?" Every nerve in George's body went rigid. His wife's fork clattered against her plate. "There's no man," she said quickly. "Eat your food." But the boy shook his head, pointing. "Right there, by the stairs. He's not moving." George turned slowly. Breath caught in his throat. The patch stood in the doorway, larger now, or closer, its edges sharper, the darkness more absolute. His grandson tilted his head, squinting. Why doesn't he have a face? That night, George lay awake beside his wife. The boy slept in the spare room, but George could hear him tossing, murmuring in dreams. "George," his wife whispered into the dark, "what if it's been here all along? What if we just didn't notice until now?" He didn't answer, because deep down, he feared she was right. The next morning, George found himself standing at the bottom of the stairs, staring up at the landing. He didn't remember walking there. The patch loomed in the corner of his eye, unmoving, silent. He spoke aloud, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Why us?" Silence. He swallowed hard. "What do you want?" The house groaned as though settling. From upstairs, a picture frame rattled faintly against the wall. And then, just for a second, George thought he heard it. A whisper, faint as breath slipping through a crack in the door. "Notice." He blinked hard. The landing was empty, but he knew with a certainty that chilled his bones that the patch had not gone. It had only learned to answer. George had stopped turning off the lights. Every lamp, every bulb in the house burned through the night, humming faintly against the silence. Even so, the corners seemed deeper than they should have been, the shadows sharper, as though the light only made the dark more determined. His wife pretended not to notice. She busied herself with laundry, dishes, anything that kept her moving. Their daughter visited more often, sometimes with her boy, sometimes alone, her eyes flicking to the hallway whenever she thought he wasn't looking. They no longer spoke of the patch directly, but silence was its own admission. One evening, George shaved in the bathroom mirror. The glass had fogged from the shower, the edges still beaded with condensation. He dragged the razor carefully along his jaw, squinting at the reflection. That was when he saw it, not behind him, not in the doorway, In the mirror itself, the patch bled into the corner of the reflection, flat, featureless, as though the glass had been stained with ink. He turned his head sharply. The bathroom corner was empty, but in the mirror, it remained. He leaned closer, breath fogging the glass, pulse hammering. The patch swelled, just slightly, as though responding. George dropped the razor into the sink with a clatter and backed away, his chest tight. When he dared glance again, the glass was clear. Only his own pale face stared back. He did not shave the next morning. That night, his wife found him sitting in the living room with every lamp on, the television muted. "You saw it again," she said quietly. He didn't answer. His hands were clenched too tightly on the arms of the chair. She came closer, her shadow falling long across the carpet. "George, we can't keep living like this." His throat was dry. "Tell me I'm not losing my mind." Her face crumpled. "You're not." For the first time, she reached out and gripped his hand. It was cold against hers. "I saw it too," she whispered, "in the mirror." Their daughter arrived the next morning, her boy trailing behind her with toy cars clutched in both fists. She tried to act normal, cooking eggs, pouring coffee, chatting about neighbors, but her voice faltered when she passed the hallway mirror. George noticed the way her gaze darted away, the stiffness in her shoulders. Finally, when the boy had gone out to the porch to play, she said low and fast, "Dad, it's not just the house. I saw it in the car window on the way here. Just for a second. Like it was riding in the back seat." George's stomach dropped. His wife's hand shook as she set down her mug. "It's following us now." That evening, they gathered in the living room again. The boy sat cross-legged on the rug, arranging his cars in neat rows. He was quieter than usual, glancing toward the stairwell with furrowed brows. "Grandpa," he said finally, "why does he only stand still?" George's heart clenched. "Who?" "The man," the boy said, pointing. His little finger trembled, aimed toward the base of the stairs. George turned, slowly, breath held. There it was, not faint this time, not half-glimpsed. The patch stood against the banister, darker than anything else in the room, so still it seemed to flatten reality around it. George's wife gasped softly. Their daughter pulled the boy close, pressing his face against her shoulder. The patch did not move, but the longer George stared, the more certain he became. It was closer than before. They began moving through the house together. No one used the hallway alone. No one went upstairs without another beside them. At night, they slept in the same room, the lamps burning hot, the air thick with dust. But the patch followed, in reflections, in windows, in the glint of the microwave door. George caught himself staring into glass too long, searching for the ink-like shape. Sometimes it was there, sometimes not. But once he thought, he saw its edges curve, as if it had lifted an arm. 3 nights later, George woke to silence deeper than any he had known. His wife and daughter breathed evenly beside him, but the air felt heavy, muffled, as if the house itself were holding its breath. He sat up slowly. At the foot of the bed, the mirror on the closet door reflected the lamp's glow, and in its corner, the patch waited. It seemed larger than the frame could hold. George's mouth went dry. He whispered before he could stop himself, "What are you?" The mirror's surface rippled faintly, just once, like water disturbed. From the hallway outside came a creak, a footstep. George stayed frozen until dawn, eyes burning, throat raw. When the sun finally bled through the blinds, the mirror showed only his own reflection again, but he could still feel it. The house hadn't slept. Neither had he. George had always believed in facing a threat head-on. 30 years in the force had carved that reflex deep into him. If you looked away, you gave it power. If you froze, you lost. But the thing in his house was not like anything he had faced before. It never lunged, never threatened. It simply stood, and still every night, he felt himself losing. By the 4th week, his wife refused to walk the stairs. She slept on the couch with the lamp burning and the television tuned to static. Their daughter stayed less often, claiming work, but George heard the fear under her excuses. Even the boy had stopped asking about the man. Children knew when silence was safer. George, though, grew restless. He could not stand the way the house seemed to shrink around the patch, every hallway a funnel leading back to it. He hated the way it pulled at his eyes, making him look when he swore he wouldn't. So one night, near midnight, he decided, he would face it. He sat in his recliner until the clock read 11:59. The house was silent, lights humming faintly. He could feel it already waiting at the base of the stairs. When the hand clicked to 12, he stood. His knees ached, but he ignored them. Step by slow step, he crossed the living room and entered the hallway. The patch was there, closer than ever, no longer just a blot, larger now, stretching from the floor to the top banister. The edges bled against the air, flat but not flat, like a hole punched through the world. George's breath shook. He forced himself to speak. "You've had your fun," he said. His voice was rough, but steady. "I'm here now." The patch did not move. He took another step. "What do you want?" The silence thickened. For a moment he thought that was all it would ever give him, its stillness. But then he heard it. A creak from the stair above. George froze. The sound was unmistakable, weight pressing into wood, but the patch was still at the bottom, wasn't it? He blinked, and in that instant it was gone. His pulse thundered. He turned, scanning the hallway. Empty. Then he realized the mirror on the wall, the one his wife always avoided, reflected more than it should. In the glass, the stairs stretched upward into darkness, and on the fourth step stood the patch, not a reflection of something behind him, not a trick of shadow. It was there in the glass, tall and patient, its edges sharper than any blur of vision. George stared at his own reflection beside it, his face pale, jaw clenched, eyes wide. He raised his hand slowly. His reflection mimicked the gesture, but the patch did not. It simply stood. "Enough," George whispered. He turned from the mirror and climbed the stairs. His hand tightened on the banister, his breath shallow. Step after step, the wood groaned under his weight. At the landing, he stopped. The hallway stretched long and narrow, the bedroom doors half open. The lamp glowed weakly at the end. The patch stood there. It filled the hall, faceless, featureless, but unmistakable. George's hands shook. He forced himself forward, each step an act of will. "You've been watching me, watching my family. Why?" Silence. Then, from the far end, the mirror on his bedroom wall flickered. His reflection stood in the glass, but not quite right. The posture was too stiff, the smile too faint, the eyes too dark. Behind his reflection, the patch loomed, closer than it was in the real hall. George's stomach turned. He lunged forward, closing the distance, heart hammering. He stopped inches from the mirror, staring into those hollow eyes. "Show me," he hissed. "Show me what you are." The reflection leaned closer. Its lips moved. For the first time, George heard words. "Behind you." It spun. The hallway was empty, but the floorboard creaked beneath a weight that wasn't his. The patch was gone from the far end. The air behind him grew colder. Slowly, against every instinct, George turned back to the mirror. His reflection was alone, but just over his shoulder, where the glass should have shown only wallpaper, the patch stood, closer than ever, watching. The house had gone quiet again, but it was not the soft quiet of a home settling into night. It was a dense, watchful silence that seemed to gather in the walls and floors and the spaces between breaths. George sat at the top of the stairs, the lamp behind him casting a faint yellow glow that barely reached the far end of the hall. He could still feel the cold where the patch had stood moments ago, a residue that clung to his skin and settled in his bones. His wife was asleep downstairs, or at least pretending to be, while his daughter had long since driven home with her boy. For the first time in weeks, he was truly alone with it, and he knew this night would not end as the others had. He had spent his life walking into danger with nothing but instinct and a badge. He had stood in the ruins of accidents, in alleys dripping with rain and something darker, in kitchens where silence clung to bruised skin. But nothing had prepared him for this, an absence that was more present than any man, a shape that was less a figure and more a failure of the world to hold together. He closed his eyes, rubbed his forehead, and told himself one last time that he had a choice: to retreat, to keep ignoring, to keep pretending the rules of habit could contain it. But deep down, he knew the choice had already been made. The patch had been waiting for him to turn fully toward it. The hallway mirror flickered faintly, though no draft stirred the lamp. George stood, legs unsteady, and approached it. His reflection stared back, older than he wanted to admit, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepened by months of sleeplessness. His jaw set in the way it always was when he refused to show fear. Yet the longer he looked, the more wrong it seemed. The reflection's eyes were not his. They were just a little too dark, a little too hollow, as if light itself could not reach them. And behind that reflection, just barely visible, the patch loomed like a hole punched in glass. He whispered, "Why me?" His voice trembled, but he did not look away. The reflection's lips moved a half-second late, as if translating his words, and then they twisted into something not quite a smile. The voice that followed did not come from his mouth, nor from the air around him, but from the mirror itself, vibrating deep in the glass. "Because you notice." The words struck him like a weight, and suddenly a dozen memories flooded back. The nights on patrol when he was the only one to catch the flicker of a hand before a knife appeared. The mornings when he read meaning in silence that others ignored. The instinct that had made him a good officer but had cost him sleep. Family dinners. Peace. He had always noticed. He had never been able to stop. George reached out and touched the glass. His fingertips met cold that was not the ordinary chill of mirror, but something deeper. A cold that seemed to pull, to hunger. The reflection's hand rose too, but not in sync. It met his touch a heartbeat late, and when their palms aligned, his skin burned as if pressed against ice. Behind him, the stair creaked again. He froze, slowly with effort. He turned his head just enough to see the landing in the corner of his eye. The patch stood there, closer than ever, swelling against the walls, its edges bleeding into the air until the hallway itself seemed narrower. He turned back to the mirror, but his reflection was gone. Only the patch filled the glass. Endless, faceless, inevitable. The pull grew stronger. His fingertips pressed deeper into the surface as though the mirror had softened, his hand sinking fraction by fraction into the black. Panic flared, but so did a strange calm. Perhaps this had been waiting for him all along. Perhaps this was the only way it ended, not with a fight, not with victory, but with surrender to the thing that had chosen him. "George," the voice came from behind him. His wife's. He hadn't heard her climb the stairs, hadn't noticed her presence until now. She stood at the landing, clutching the banister, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes widened as she took in the sight of him, arm buried up to the wrist in glass that rippled like water. "Don't," she whispered, tears streaking her cheeks. "Please don't." George wanted to answer, but the pull was too strong. The black was up to his elbow now, cold searing his skin, and in its depth he felt a strange promise. Not peace exactly, but release from the endless vigilance, the noticing, the waiting for something worse. His body trembled as he turned his head toward her, managed a hoarse whisper. "I think it already chose." The mirror swallowed his shoulder, his chest, his face. For a moment, the hallway was filled with a low rushing sound, like breath drawn in through an unseen mouth. The light flickered, the air dropped several degrees, and then, with one final ripple, the glass stilled. The mirror showed only his wife now, standing alone at the top of the stairs, staring at her own reflection. George was gone. In the days that followed, the house grew quieter still. His wife refused to enter the hallway at night. She slept downstairs, lamps blazing, the television murmuring until dawn. Their daughter avoided the subject altogether, speaking of errands and weather while her eyes darted always to the staircase. The boy, too young to understand, asked only once more, "Where's Grandpa?" No one answered, but sometimes, in the corner of her eye, his wife thought she saw him. Not as he was, but as a darker patch standing at the end of the hall, faceless, patient, watching, and when she passed the mirror too quickly, she thought she saw his outline there too, not quite aligned with her own reflection, waiting just behind the glass. She never told her daughter. She never told anyone. Some things were heavier left unspoken, and the patch never left. Story 7. The Final Breath. Maria had worked the night shift long enough to know the sounds of the ward by heart. The steady whir of oxygen concentrators, the faint click of IV drips, the low murmur of nurses at the far desk. Even the buzz of fluorescent lights overhead had its own rhythm, a weary hum that faded in and out like a tired heartbeat. What unsettled her was not the expected sounds, but the one she had begun to dread, the small, dry thud that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. The first time she heard it, she had been standing outside room 204, chart in hand. A single, hollow note, like a weight dropping from a shelf, soft, almost apologetic. yet sharp enough to make her stop mid-sentence. 10 minutes later, the man in 204 passed away in his sleep. She told herself it was coincidence. Hospitals were full of noises. Pipes clanged, ducts shifted, ceiling tiles shifted in their frames. But when it happened again a week later, another dull thud, another patient gone, her certainty cracked. By the third time, she could no longer ignore it. The ward at night was its own world, cut off from the daytime bustle. The elderly who remained were mostly quiet, some asleep, some murmuring to themselves in twilight states. The halls were long and half-lit, the paint yellowed, the floors scuffed from decades of gurney wheels. Maria had grown used to that atmosphere. She even found it comforting at times. But after the third sound, the comfort had curdled into something else. She started listening differently. Every creak of the building made her chest tighten. Every rattling vent pulled her attention, and always she wondered if she was about to hear it again, that soft, dreadful punctuation that seemed to mark the end of a life. It came back on a Tuesday. She was in the lounge, sipping bitter coffee from a styrofoam cup, when the silence fractured. Thud, barely audible, but unmistakable. A sound not of the ward, not of machinery. It was the same note that had haunted her memory for weeks. Her stomach dropped. She stood, spilling coffee onto her scrubs, and strained her ears. The sound had come from above, she was sure of it, as if something heavy had fallen on the ceiling directly overhead. Her gaze darted to the patient board. Room 310 was above her. Her pulse quickened. She knew who was in 310. Mrs. Leary, a frail woman with hands like paper and eyes that still shone with mischief whenever Maria teased her. Maria bolted from the lounge, sneakers squeaking against linoleum. Her breath caught high in her chest. By the time she reached 310, the monitors were already flatlining. She worked with the team to try and resuscitate, hands pressing, compressions counting, sweat dripping down her temple. But in her heart, she knew it was useless. The sound had already told her. Afterward, when the room was quiet again, she sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the ceiling. Her hands shook. She whispered, "Why do I hear it?" The tiles above stared back in silence, dust collecting at the seams. Maria told no one. Her colleagues laughed easily, dismissed omens, trusted only charts and machines. She knew what they would say. Stress, insomnia, the toll of working nights. But the sound was not imagined. She could feel it in her bones, an impact too real to be dismissed. She began to fear walking the halls alone. Each step echoed. Each shadow seemed to carry weight. Her eyes were drawn constantly upward, searching the ceiling for cracks, for signs of anything that could explain it. Nothing ever did. By the end of that month, she had heard it 7 times, and 7 lives had ended within minutes. Maria's sleep fractured. She woke with her ears ringing, her heart racing. She dreamed of ceilings collapsing, of bodies falling through empty air, of that single dry thud reverberating endlessly through sterile hallways. She stopped drinking coffee, stopped talking much with the other nurses. She lived in anticipation of the sound, every night waiting for it to return, and it always did. One night, she lingered outside room 301, flipping through charts just to stay moving. The ward was hushed. Her sneakers squeaked faintly as she shifted from foot to foot. Then it came. Thud. This time it was louder, directly above her head. Her chest clenched. She looked up, eyes tracing the seams of the ceiling tiles, half expecting to see dust sift down. She turned slowly toward the patient's door. Inside, Mr. Hensley lay still, his breath shallow, his chest rising and falling like fragile glass. Maria's hands trembled as she touched the doorknob. She didn't want to go in. She didn't want to confirm what she already knew. She stood frozen until the monitor screamed, and she was forced to move. Afterward, she sat in the lounge again, staring at her reflection in the dark window. Her face looked older, more hollow, her eyes ringed with sleepless nights. She whispered to the empty room, "Why me? Why do I hear it when no one else does?" Her reflection did not answer, but she thought she saw the glass ripple faintly, as if in sympathy. Maria started carrying a small notebook in her pocket. It wasn't standard practice. She already had the official charts, the endless paperwork, the electronic logs, but the notebook was different. The notebook was for her alone, for the sounds. The first page bore only a date and a single word, Thud. She wrote down the time, the location, the room number that corresponded to the ceiling beneath which she had heard it, and, inevitably, the patient who died within minutes. By the end of 2 weeks, the pages were filling with a neat, obsessive script, times ranging from 1:14 a.m. to 4:37 a.m. Rooms spread across the third floor, always above her, always before. Patterns emerged. They chilled her. It never happened during the day. Never when the halls were crowded. Only in the silent depth of night, when the hospital seemed to fold in on itself, and always 10 minutes before the end. Never more, never less. Maria tried to disprove herself. She checked maintenance reports, asked casual questions about the HVAC system. She even persuaded the janitor, Mr. Colton, to walk the halls with her one night. Listening together beneath the ceiling panels, he heard nothing. He shrugged, his mop bucket sloshing against the linoleum. Old buildings groan, pipes shift. Place like this, there's 1,000 reasons for a knock or a drop. You just notice them more on nights. She forced a smile, nodded, let him go. But she knew it wasn't pipes. Pipes didn't keep perfect time with death. One shift, curiosity drove her to the third floor. She told herself it was coincidence that she arrived just after hearing the sound below. The hall above was silent. She walked slowly, sneakers squeaking faintly, her eyes scanning the ceiling. The rooms here were identical to those below, same faded paint, same beds and machines, but the patients were different, asleep, breathing, alive. She pressed her palm to the ceiling tile where she thought the sound had come from. It was cold, inert. Dust clung to her skin, but beneath her hand, she imagined a faint vibration, a pulse. She jerked back, heart racing. A nurse passing by gave her a curious glance. Maria forced a cough, muttered something about checking for leaks, and hurried away. Later, she convinced herself to check the security cameras. Not all the halls were monitored, but some corners were. She logged into the console during a quiet hour, scrolling through grainy footage. There it was, the time stamped 2:43 a.m., the moment she had written in her notebook. She leaned closer, eyes narrowing. The hall appeared normal. Fluorescent lights flickered, shadows stretched. Nothing fell, nothing shifted. The patient slept undisturbed. But at the precise moment she had noted, the screen fuzzed, not static, not glitch, something like a ripple across the lens, as though the air itself had thickened. It lasted less than a second. When it cleared, everything looked the same, except Maria, watching hours later, could swear the shadows along the ceiling seemed darker. She shut the monitor off, palms damp. When she walked back into the ward, the silence pressed heavier than before. She clutched the notebook, knuckles white. She told herself she was imagining things, stringing together coincidences. Yet her chest knew better. Her bones knew better. And when the thud came again that night, she didn't even flinch. She just looked at the clock. 10 minutes. It was harder to hide her fear. The other nurses noticed her tension, the way she froze mid-step sometimes, eyes darting upward. "You all right, Maria?" one asked, setting down a tray of linens. "Fine," she lied. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Maria laughed too quickly. "I guess we all do in this job." But inside, she was trembling. Ghosts were easier. Ghosts were explainable in their own way. This was not. One evening she stayed after her shift. Long past dawn, she wandered the empty halls as cleaning crews bustled and day nurses arrived. The building felt different in daylight, less oppressive, yet the ceilings loomed the same. She climbed the narrow maintenance ladder near the service closet, pushing aside a ceiling panel. Above stretched a crawl space, dusty beams, tangled wires, pipes she could trace with her fingers. No footprints, no disturbance, nothing to explain the sound that haunted her. She crouched there for nearly half an hour, waiting, ears straining. All she heard was the hum of electricity, the faint rush of water, but still, the memory of the sound lingered. She climbed down, heart heavy. Whatever it was, it didn't live in the pipes. It lived in the silence. By the third month, Maria could predict it almost without hearing. The air would change first, thinning, turning heavy. Her ears would ring. A prickle would crawl along her scalp, then thud. She would look at the clock. 10 minutes later, monitors screamed. No one else ever noticed. No one else seemed to hear. Patients died. Charts were updated. Doctors sighed. Life moved on. But Maria carried the weight of every sound in her notebook, every life measured not in beats or breaths, but in that single, small note from above. And the more she wrote, the more she wondered. Not why she heard it, but what would happen if she ever heard it in the wrong place. Not above a patient's room, but above her own. Maria no longer trusted the silence. Once, she had thought of it as an ally, a protective blanket that covered the ward after midnight, allowing her to walk the long corridors with a certain calm rhythm, the hum of machines steadying her thoughts, the muted breaths of sleeping patients reminding her of the fragile persistence of life. But now the quiet was never simply quiet. It seemed weighted, thickened, and aware. Every moment she spent inside it carried with it the possibility of that dry, familiar impact from above, a sound so soft it could have been overlooked if not for what always followed. The first time she heard it outside a patient's room, she was in the supply closet, balancing a clipboard on one arm while counting boxes of gauze. The light overhead buzzed faintly, shadows from the shelving stretching across the walls in thin gray lines. Then, without warning, the noise arrived, a low, hollow thud from the ceiling just above her head. Her hand stilled. The pencil slipped and clattered across the shelf, but she barely noticed. The instinct rose immediately. Look at the clock. Count the minutes. Brace yourself for the sound of a monitor flatlining. Except there were no monitors here. No bed beneath that ceiling. No fragile lungs waiting to collapse. There was only her, standing in a cramped room with shelves and dust. And yet she knew it had been the same sound. Later that week, she heard it again, this time inside the elevator. The car swayed faintly as it descended, the fluorescent panel overhead flickering with every shift and weight, and then the dull impact reverberated through the metal box, soft but undeniable. Her heart lurched. She pressed herself against the wall, eyes darting upward, certain that the next 10 minutes would end with something, perhaps her own body, collapsing on the floor. But when the doors opened, the hospital continued as it always did. Orderlies pushed carts of linens. A doctor shuffled past with a yawn. No one else seemed to have heard. She stepped out, knees weak, clutching her chest, and realized she was no longer waiting for the sound near others. She was waiting for it to claim her directly. When the dreams began, the dread deepened. In her sleep, she walked hallways that stretched far longer than the building should allow, the pale walls lined with identical doors that extended into shadow. The floor glistened as if freshly washed, reflecting the ceiling lights that hummed faintly overhead. She would move forward, slow and cautious, hearing the echo of her footsteps. Then the sound would come dull, dry, inevitable. Thud. Every door would open just enough for a seam of blackness to show, and she would whisper, begging without knowing who she was speaking to. Not me. Please, not me. Then the sound would fall again, closer, reverberating inside her bones, until she woke with a start, drenched in sweat, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might tear itself apart. Even after waking, the echo clung to her ears, faint but persistent, as though it had followed her out of the dream. The notebook in her pocket had grown heavier with every entry. At first it was just a handful of pages, dates, times, room numbers. Now it contained not only the deaths but also the places where the sound had come without any patient above. Moments in closets, stairwells, the elevator, places where it had no reason to echo. She had stopped opening it at the end of her shift. The weight of the words pressed down on her more than exhaustion ever could. She feared the act of writing itself might feed whatever this was, as if by marking the sound she was making a contract with it. Her colleagues noticed the change. They would glance at her sidelong as she stiffened mid-step, as she tilted her head toward the ceiling, her face tightening as if bracing for a blow. One of the younger nurses tried gently to intervene, suggesting she take a break, maybe a week away, some time to clear her head. Maria forced a laugh, the sound brittle, and muttered that she was fine, though her trembling hands betrayed her. Ghost stories belonged in the homes of patients' families, whispered to grandchildren, not in the mouths of the staff who kept the hospital alive. Yet she knew that what she carried was not a story. It was a pattern. The worst came on a night so hushed that even the lights seemed dimmer, the hum fainter, as if the hospital itself were holding its breath. She slipped into the staff lounge, collapsed into the chair, rubbed her eyes with the heels of her palms, and let the clock tick past 2:30. Her head had just begun to lower toward her arms when the sound arrived, so familiar now that she recognized it before it ended. A small, hollow thud from the ceiling directly above her. Her body froze. The glass of water on the table trembled under her fingertips. For a moment she thought she had imagined it, but the sensation in her chest told her otherwise. She looked at the clock. 2:31. She knew the rhythm too well. 10 minutes. Her stomach clenched as she waited, certain the room itself was about to become her ward. Her monitors about to scream, her body about to give out. She stood, pacing, whispering to herself that it was not real. It was stress. It was fatigue. But the clock hands crawled, each second stretching like an eternity. At 2:41, she stood rigid, gripping the back of the chair so tightly her knuckles burned white. At 2:43, she pressed her palms against her chest, listening for weakness. At 2:50, the 10th minute, she braced herself for silence, for collapse, for nothingness. And yet, nothing happened. The ward beyond her door remained steady. The monitors hummed. The patient slept. The world did not end. Relief flooded her in waves, but it was not clean relief. It was poisoned with dread, because the sound had never lied. It had always kept its rhythm, always spoken truth in its quiet, dreadful way. This time it had not meant now. This time it had meant soon. From that night forward, Maria lived not in anticipation of coincidence, but in certainty of a debt. Every creak of the building felt like an omen. Every shadow in the corner of her eye seemed heavier. Every breath she drew seemed borrowed. She no longer feared the sound above patient rooms. She feared the sound that followed her, the sound that had chosen her. And sometimes when she passed beneath the ceiling tiles, she thought she heard not just the hollow impact, but the faint hiss of breath being drawn in, waiting, as though the sound itself were alive, patient, and listening for the moment it would finally fall again. This time not above another bed, but above her own. Maria began to notice that the sound was no longer confined to single places or single hours. It had grown bolder, less restrained, as if its patience with subtlety had run out. In the past, it had always struck cleanly, once, then waited in silence for the inevitable. Now it seemed to echo in clusters, a rhythm that carried through corridors, through the metal frames of doors, through her own ribcage until she felt her bones were vibrating. It started on a Wednesday, in the lull between 2 and 3 a.m. The ward was hushed, the patients breathing soft and steady, the machines pulsing their faint green lights. Maria was walking her usual circuit, checking monitors, adjusting IV lines, smoothing blankets. She had just stepped into the hallway when the first thud came. It was above her head, so familiar now that her chest tightened at once. But before she could even glance at the clock, a second sound followed from farther down the hall, then another, and then another, as though something heavy were moving across the ceiling from room to room. She stood frozen, clutching the chart in her hands, her eyes tracing the line of fluorescent lights overhead. Each panel seemed suddenly fragile, each seam between tiles a threshold through which the sound might break. She whispered under her breath, "No, not all of them. Please not all at once." And then she realized what terrified her most. Not that it might fall above many rooms, but that it might not be tied to rooms anymore at all. For the next 10 minutes, her heart pounded as she waited for the chorus of monitors that should have followed. Yet the hall remained steady, the room silent but alive, the elderly breathing in their fragile rhythms. Nothing ended. The sound had passed without taking. That should have comforted her, but it did the opposite. If the rule was broken, if the sound was no longer precise, then there was no rhythm she could cling to, no pattern she could prepare for. The next nights grew worse. The sound came not only above patient rooms, but above the nurse's desk, in the staff restroom, even once in the stairwell when she was carrying a tray of supplies. The hollow weight of it seemed to chase her, like a hunter tapping along the walls of a maze. Sometimes she swore she heard it in multiple places at once, as though the ceiling itself were alive and restless. Her colleagues began to notice her flinching at every noise, her constant scanning of the ceiling tiles. One asked if she was all right, and Maria almost told the truth, almost begged them to listen more carefully, to tell her they heard it too. But she bit back the words, because if they confirmed it, if someone else acknowledged the sound, she feared it would grow stronger, that it needed witnesses to spread. Still, the weight of secrecy crushed her. At times, she caught herself pressing her hands over her ears, trying to block the noise before it came, only to realize she could hear it through her bones. It was not sound alone. It was impact, vibration, something that used her own body as a resonator. On the fourth week of its escalation, she dreamed again of the endless hallway, the doors stretching into infinity. But this time the doors did not just open a crack. They swung wide, one after another, darkness pouring out like smoke. The thud repeated over and over, closer each time, until she realized it was not above her anymore but within her, as though each beat of her heart struck the same hollow note. She woke gasping in the lounge, her pulse hammering, the notebook clutched so tightly in her hand that the pages were crumpled. When she opened it, she found that she had written in her sleep. The ink was jagged, letters scrawled across the page in her own handwriting. It isn't warning, it's calling. She dropped the notebook onto the floor and pressed her hands to her face, whispering through her fingers, No, that isn't true, it can't be true. Yet a deeper part of her, the part that had never lied when it sensed danger, knew the words were right. One night, just after 3, the call light for room 301 blinked. Maria moved quickly down the hall, her shoes squeaking faintly on the waxed linoleum. But before she reached the door, the sound came again. Thud. It was not above her this time. It was directly behind her. She spun, heart in her throat, but the corridor was empty, the lamps humming their pale light. She backed against the door, hand fumbling for the handle, eyes locked on the ceiling tiles overhead. She whispered into the emptiness, I hear you. I know you're there. What do you want from me? For a moment, there was only silence. Then another thud, softer, almost intimate, directly above her head, and she thought she heard a faint hiss riding the echo, a word so small it might have been imagined. Soon, she stumbled into room 301, breath ragged, startling the patient who blinked at her with watery confusion. She forced herself to smile, adjusted the blanket, checked the IV, muttered some excuse about being nearby, but the word would not leave her ears. Soon. From then on, Maria lived with the certainty that the sound had shifted its focus. It no longer announced death to her. It announced her to death. Each repetition was not a warning for others, but a rehearsal for her. The notebook lay abandoned in her locker. She no longer needed to write, because she knew where the final entry would lead. She avoided looking at the ceiling, but that only made the weight of it heavier, as if the unseen tiles pressed lower with every step. She felt them breathing, shifting, listening. At times she thought she saw the dust above stir without draft, as though something massive was crawling unseen across the beams. Her nights became a waiting game. She moved through the ward with deliberate calm, helping patients, adjusting machines, smiling where she could, all the while listening for the hollow mark of her own ending. And when it did not come, she grew more restless, more certain that the delay was only another kind of cruelty. She wondered often whether anyone would understand if she told them, if she explained how every thud was not just a sound but a promise. But she knew the truth. The only way anyone else would believe was if they too began to hear it, and she would not wish that weight on anyone. On the last night of that week, she sat in the lounge again, the lamps buzzing faintly, her head bowed over her folded arms. The clock ticked toward 3. She whispered to the empty room, If it has to be me, then let it be me. Stop circling, stop waiting. Just come. For a long while there was only silence. And then, slowly, the ceiling above her groaned. Not a single note this time. Not one thud. A cascade. The sound of weight after weight dropping in sequence. A series of hollow impacts that rolled across the ceiling like footsteps. Each note echoed through the walls, the floor, the marrow of her bones, until she felt her chest tightening, her breath catching, her heart fighting to keep rhythm with the impossible beat. She staggered to her feet, hands pressed against her ears, eyes darting upward, and in that moment she knew the truth she had been dreading since the first sound weeks ago. It was not just a warning. It was coming for her. The hospital at night had its own kind of stillness, but in these last weeks Maria had come to know it not as peace, not as rest, but as a vast and patient attention pressing down on her from the ceilings, the walls, even the air itself. The silence was no longer background. It was a stage, and she was standing alone at the center. That night began like any other. She made her rounds with quiet precision, straightening blankets, checking monitors, speaking softly to those who stirred in half-sleep. The old man in 210 reached for her wrist with a trembling hand, and she held it until he calmed, whispering that he was safe. In 312, she adjusted a drip line while the patient breathed through an oxygen mask, each exhale misting faintly in the light. On the surface, nothing was different. The hospital continued its endless rhythm of care and decline. Of frailty held at bay for one more hour, but Maria felt it waiting. She had felt it since the beginning of her shift. A weight above her head, a pressure in her ears. Every step she took was measured against the certainty that at any moment the sound might come again. Her notebook lay forgotten in her locker, but the pattern it had taught her was etched into her bones. 10 minutes, always 10, until it wasn't. By 2 o'clock she was too restless to sit in the lounge, so she lingered in the corridor, sipping lukewarm coffee, eyes scanning the ceiling tiles as if she might see through them. The air seemed thinner here, brittle, as though a single sound could shatter it. And then it came. Thud, directly above her, not in a patient's room, not in a hallway beyond, but here, in the staff lounge where she stood alone. The sound was heavier than before, sharper, as though the ceiling itself had absorbed something unbearable and dropped it into the space between her breaths. Her coffee cup slipped from her hand and shattered on the linoleum, but she didn't flinch at the noise. Her entire body had already locked into stillness, her gaze fixed on the ceiling where dust sifted faintly down through the fluorescent glow. She looked at the clock. 2:37. 10 minutes. Her heart hammered as she whispered, "Not me. Please not me." But even as she said it, she felt the truth already sealed. The sound had never lied. It had circled her for weeks, teased her, warned her, and now it had landed. She sat at the desk, trembling, her eyes never leaving the second hand as it crawled. At 2:40, her pulse roared so loudly she thought the monitors in the rooms nearby would register it. At 2:45, her hands went numb, the pen she had been holding rolling silently across the desk. At 2:47, she pressed her palms to her chest, waiting for the collapse. At 2:50, the silence deepened, and then the phone rang. She jumped, the shrill note cutting through the stillness like a blade. She grabbed the receiver with shaking hands, pressed it to her ear, and whispered, "Hello?" Static filled the line, soft and steady, like the hush of breath. Then a voice came, her own voice. "Maria," it said, low and ragged, exactly as she had whispered her name to herself in fear. "It's time." Her grip slackened, the receiver slipping, but the voice continued, pouring through the static in broken fragments, her own tone, her own words, sentences she had spoken in the lounge in recent nights. Every plea, every denial. "Not me. Please, I hear you. What do you want?" The blood drained from her face. She glanced at the phone console and saw the extension glowing. The call was not from another floor, not from outside. It was from the staff lounge, from the phone she was holding. Her stomach turned to ice. She dropped the receiver. It swung against the desk with a hollow knock, the voice still whispering her words in endless loops. She stumbled backward, colliding with the chair, eyes locked on the ceiling. And then it came again. Thud, louder than ever, so heavy the light fixtures trembled, so final it seemed to settle in her bones. She clutched her chest, waiting for the pain, the blackout, the silence, but nothing came, only the steady hum of the lights, the faint beeping of distant machines, and the soft whisper still leaking from the phone on the desk, repeating her own words back to her in a voice that was both hers and not hers. She sank into the chair, numb, her breath shallow. Her eyes flicked to the clock. 2:50. The 10 minutes had passed. She was still alive. For now. The days that followed blurred. She moved through her shifts like a ghost, her colleagues whispering about her hollow eyes, her distracted steps. The patients watched her with a strange reverence, as if they sensed she carried something heavier than the charts in her hands. She tried not to listen for the sound, but it was always there, just beyond hearing, like a thought you cannot dismiss. Sometimes she caught herself staring at the ceiling too long, waiting. Sometimes she thought she heard the faintest scrape of movement above, a breath drawn in anticipation. And always, when she picked up the phone to answer a call, her heart stopped until she heard another voice instead of her own. She never told anyone about that night. She never told them the sound had already claimed her. She simply went on, hour by hour, step by step, moving beneath the ceilings that waited with their weight in silence. And when the thud came again, she no longer marked the time. She only whispered, "Soon," and kept walking. And so the stories end, or at least they end for tonight. 7 echoes carried across the dark, a siren hiding in the static, a confession whispered in the blackout, an almanac that fed the soil with more than rain, a train that reached its last stop with no one human aboard, a locksmith sealing doors that should never have opened, a patch of darkness that learned to move, and a nurse who heard the breath of death before it came. They are finished, yet unfinished. Stories like these never really close. They linger in the walls, in the corners of mirrors, in the hum of the line when you think no one is calling. If you are lying in bed now, eyes heavy, I hope sleep finds you quickly, though it may not come easily. And if you are still awake, listening with the lamp burning low, remember this: the night is long, and it is never empty. This has been your companion in the hours when the world forgets you're awake. Until we meet again, keep your ears open, keep your lights low, and don't be surprised if, sometime soon, you hear a sound that no one else can. Good night, and good luck making it to morning.